according to computer, and I'm just about to let everyone in.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning. My name's Patrick McVeigh. I am the lead for People and Places with the consultancy Martin Jenkins. I'm very happy to have been asked once again to be your MC for the Congress this year. We've obviously switched online, and it's great to see you all here. Martin Jenkins, once again, very happy to be the primary sponsor of this year's Congress. Alongside our other sponsors, Taranaki and Tawaka. But also, I think this year it's really important to acknowledge all of our speakers who are speaking free of charge. We've got some excellent speakers over the course of this week, and I'd like to acknowledge all of them for their willingness to participate and to help support New Zealand's economic development community. Couple of kind of protocols as we're getting started. I think all of us have had lots of experience over the last couple of months of kind of living online, whether it's on Zoom or Teams. And we know that the first thing we should probably recognize is that we all probably need to be patient and be kind with each other. We always know that things can go wrong, and if they go wrong at our end, we will endeavor to get you connected back up as soon as possible. Hopefully technology gods will smile on us through the course of the week, but let's all be patient as we move through it. The other thing, which I'm sure many of you are used to doing now, is I'd suggest you might turn your cameras off, turn your microphones off unless you're speaking. This probably helps with the bandwidth, but also keeps it easy when we've got, I think, 180 people registered over the week to be able to kind of keep the system moving smoothly. We're suggesting that you use the chat function. We've got a really packed program, and it'd be great if you could put your kind of comments and questions in chat. I'll try and keep an eye on those and put those key sort of themes back to our speakers. All of our speakers will hopefully leave a few moments at the end of their sessions to take some observations and questions. That will be really helpful if we can do that. As I've said to a couple of the speakers already, I'll also turn my camera off and then turn it back on when they're running out of time as a way of reminding them that we're moving through the program. I mentioned the great list of speakers that we've got, and I should say, acknowledge the work that Susan Houston has done to put all the speakers together into this program over the next few days. Now, in order to open the Congress, I'm very pleased to first introduce Pam Ford. Pam is the Chair of Economic Development New Zealand, and she's also the General Manager of Economic Development at ATED. Morena, Pam, it's great to see you, and welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. E te whānau, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko maunga tautu I te maunga, ko Waikato te awa. Ko Ngāti Aotearoa te iwi, ko Pamela Ford toko ingo. Ko taku mahi ki EDNZ, ko te chair. Welcome to you all to our Economic Development New Zealand whānau here this morning, Monday, 7th of September 2020. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to kick off this 2020 Congress titled From Revitalisation, a week of stimulating significant addresses from people who, like all of us, care deeply about the economic and social impacts of COVID-19. Each day this week we have a theme and 4 to 5 sessions for you to choose to dip into during your workday. As Patrick said, thank you to all our speakers who are presenting on Zoom over the week, and thank you to Susan Houston, our EDNZ Chair, our Chief Executive, and the Congress Committee for curating such a fabulous program. And thank you to our Premier sponsor, Martin Jenkins. We appreciate your ongoing support. The world has been here before. Just over 100 years ago, the 1918 influenza epidemic infected about 1/3 of the world's population. 50 million deaths worldwide, 9,000 of those in New Zealand, over just 2 months. A significant and hugely disproportionate impact on Māori, including a death rate more than 8 times those for Pākehā, sometimes destroying entire communities. Worldwide, it is also known that the cities at that time and regions that intervened early and more aggressively, putting in place distancing, closing schools, actually experienced a relative increase in real economic activity after the pandemic subsided. Who would have predicted that the year 2020, such a perfectly symmetrically numbered year, would turn out to be such an imperfect storm for the whole world? On 11 March 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, noting that pandemic is not a word to use lightly or carelessly. Pandemics, by definition, are global. In April, a University of Oxford paper on the economic impact of COVID-19 said, the economic fallout from this pandemic is likely to cripple even the most resilient of markets, threatening national and global growth. They went on to say the true cost of COVID-19 will therefore be far greater than the direct health costs of treating cases. Indeed, the indirect costs of the disease will far outstrip the costs of testing, treating, and hospitalisation of patients. And the extent of these indirect costs, including economic damage, will depend on how protracted the pandemic becomes, the steps governments take to contain it, the impact of and public adherence to behavioural measures such as physical distancing imposed by authorities, and how much economic support governments and development agencies are willing to deploy during the pandemic's immediate impact and aftermath. And as we have seen, each country has responded in its own way. Here in New Zealand, the government's Go Hard, Go Early strategy saw us move from full level 4 of lockdown to level 1 and enjoy 102 days living in relative smugness, albeit many businesses counting or recouping the costs of level 4, none more so than the tourism, hospitality and retail sectors. On 5 August, just 1 month ago, a business summit was held in Auckland. 200 leaders gathered to address the challenges and opportunities of a COVID-19 world. The optimism was palpable. That optimism centred around a hope for a more equitable future, that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that we would grow back better and make the most of the advantage we had in an elimination strategy. People like Francis Valentine spoke about growing sectors in the future that better reflect some of the new industries of the world and position us strongly for innovation and creativity. Little did we know on the 5th of August that just 1 week later, the cold reality of community transmission would hit the region, that both economically and psychologically, the region plummeted backwards. Treasury's latest weekly economic update on Friday highlighted the business and consumer confidence both weakened in August across New Zealand, reflecting the impacts of higher alert levels. You could be forgiven for feeling that we are living in a scene that resembles the science fiction novel The Eyes of Darkness by Dean Koontz. His 1981 book had the uncanny prediction of a pandemic called, would you believe, the Wuhan 400. Of all the cities in the world, in China, he chose a city where the actual virus broke out almost 20 years later. Fortunately, the coincidence stops there, and that COVID-19 does not have the 100% fatality rate of the Dean Koontz imagined virus. And as in 1918, pandemic, as Maya Angelou, every storm runs out of rain. More than that, while hunkered down in the storm, we have a chance to pause and reimagine the future. That is our opportunity. Many or most would say that is our imperative. COVID-19 has held the entire world hostage, producing a resemblance to the post-apocalyptic world depicted in many science fiction texts. These texts, though, usually illustrate impacts on the globe, city or region as one catastrophic event that doesn't discriminate. But COVID-19 has shown up disproportionate impacts either by sector or by community. Since March this year, whole industries have plummeted. Overnight, Air New Zealand went from being a $6 billion business to losing 99% of its revenue. What did that mean? Pilots, highly qualified engineers, executives, all out of work, most of them for the first time in their lives. Thousands of foreign workers, many in hospitality, are stranded, not able to work, not able to go home, not able to access welfare. Our reliance on supply chains has affected manufacturing, increased the cost of shipping and air freight, and our reliance on an immigrant workforce from farm workers to senior executives has been challenged. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed inequities and disparities, locally and globally. For example, digital equity. How do school children learn remotely in lockdown if they do not have access to devices or consistent internet connectivity? Or if you do have a job, it's near impossible to work from home because of overcrowding in your house or cold homes in winter. It's warmer and quieter to work in the car. So how will we make better? A New Zealand organisation, the Lever Group, has developed a framework they hope will be useful to those currently making decisions and spending significant resources understanding how best to build back better. Where ultimately a healthier, more resilient and prosperous society is created for all New Zealanders. At the 5 August summit I spoke of earlier, many speakers urged for a transformation approach, not merely recovery. Tanya Pōwhiri of the Southern Initiative spoke of the opportunity for radical transformation, where prosperity is equitably shared and a new economy that enhances the mana of all people. Rob Campbell reminded us that the same problems of social inequity and environmental degradation remain, but COVID-19 has highlighted them, and they demand our attention. And Kirsten Tawau of Vodafone spoke of a more cohesive, connected and collaborative approach to working through this time. That cohesive and connected approach is essential everywhere, from local neighbourhoods, towns, cities, interregionally, nationally and among countries. We cannot be an isolated nation forever. We proudly depend on our international connections and connectivity. Mayurika Chakravorty wrote in the web-based science newsfeed ScienceX recently. The pandemic is not merely in its spread. One needs to harness its globality to counter and eventually defeat it. As Israeli historian Yuval Harari notes, in the choice between national isolationism and global solidarity, we must choose the latter and adopt a spirit of global cooperation and trust. What an Italian doctor discovers in Milan, he says, in the early morning might well save lives in Tehran by the evening. When the UK government hesitates between several policies, it can get advice from the Koreans who have already faced a similar dilemma a month ago. He goes on to say, tightening immigration can temporarily staunch the flow of people, but the virus, like the million murdering death, is a treacherous in its border-defying agility. Presently, as many nations experience a resurgence of nationalism and exclusionary policies of walls and borders, the pandemic is a harsh reminder of the lived reality of our transnational interconnectedness. And so we all have a lot on our minds and a lot to do as economic development practitioners. Attending the Congress 2020 is a great way to take time this week to get inspired, learn and connect with people across Aotearoa New Zealand. Most of all, share your ideas with your colleagues, shareholders and partners from what you learn this week. We very much are still in the eye of this health and economic storm of our lifetime. How and what we do and how we're going to prepare for the challenge of the new dawn. First, we must get through this storm and support our businesses and communities. Ultimately, we want to make things better for our people, our communities, and ultimately our country. Stand up to the challenge and use your convening power your mana, your influence to make a better community. And to quote Maya Angelou once more, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Enjoy the sessions this week. There is a stellar lineup of excellent content from all over New Zealand, regional and local stories, views from our political leaders and experts such as today with Shaman, Brad and Ganesh, and I'm looking forward to them all. Debate and discuss among yourselves online, start a discussion, please provide us feedback, and I'll see you again at the end of the week. Kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui. Be strong, be brave, be steadfast. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou. Back to you, Patrick, and on with the show.
Thanks very much, Pam. A great way to start Congress. We've got, as Pam said, a stellar lineup this morning as we talk about the theme of the economic impact of COVID-19. And we're very lucky to have the speakers that have confirmed for today, and I hope you enjoy them. I'm going to start by handing over to Shamubel Jacob from Sense Partners. Shamubel probably needs no introduction to most of you. He's been a frequent commentator and advisor through not just this pandemic, but over many years in New Zealand. Shamubel, welcome.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for having me at the Congress today. I was in the middle of testing my slides and I'm still in the front. All right, here we go. I was given a really big topic and you've got a great lineup of economists coming up. So I thought what we'll talk about is what is the big picture view of where we're headed and what does the world look like post-pandemic? And one of the big things for me is that there's just so much uncertainty. We need to make sure that we think about it in the wider context of the changes that are taking place and where we fit as economic development experts. And the starting point, I think, is very similar to what we've been talking about over the course of the last 6 months. As this pandemic hit, it became very clear that this is going to be one of the biggest economic shocks, biggest sort of political shocks that we have seen in our lifetimes. And that certainly is playing through. And it's been a bit of a tsunami, right? It's happened really quickly and it's crashed into us very, very fast. But at the same time, we've seen extraordinary amount of adaptation that's taken place, huge amount of flexibility and resilience in many parts of our society and many parts of our economy, and that's good. But at the same time, we've also seen this incredible entrenching and exposition of the existing gaps that we have in society, whether it's around poverty, whether it's around regions of New Zealand, whether it's around our reliance on particular parts of our economy. All of those things have really come through over the course of the last 6 months. The thing that's really shocked me is just how compressed this economic shock has been. We've lost around 75,000 jobs in the course of the last 6 months. That's pretty much all the jobs we had lost in the entire recession of the global financial crisis, and that took us nearly a year and a half. You know, we still have months of this to come. So this is much bigger than what we have seen before. But the other thing that has really come through for me is it's not good enough to wait for official data to come. It's not good enough to look at national data because what's happening locally is not necessarily what's happening elsewhere. We're seeing a very different kind of pattern of economic impact, very different patterns of resilience across different parts of New Zealand. And this localism is extraordinarily important, particularly for you folk, because you live and breathe that every single day. And I think for me, the big thing that's come through is that at the moment, we're seeing these different strategies being applied in different parts of New Zealand. And we need to really work with each other to make sure that we understand which policies are successful and which ones are not. And the other thing that's really come through is just the importance of agility, because what we're seeing is that while we've got some businesses that are really, really good at adapting to this change, there are others that are not. So, you know, we see, for example, many businesses don't have an online presence. They don't have the ability to sell online. So when you're not able to physically open your business, only those businesses that have the online presence are able to sell, and they are doing really, really well as a result of this. But when I look forward, not to the next 6 weeks, 6 months, but the next 6 years and 10 years, I think one of the things that's becoming much more clear is that we are in this period of extraordinary change. So the pandemic is something that's going to end at some point. and we will come out of it. But following what we saw a decade ago with the global financial crisis, what we have seen with 30 years of no change in inequality, falling home ownership rates, worsening climate change, all of those things are slowly going to come to, I think, a bit of a shock. And the COVID-19 response, both in terms of the economic shock and the huge amount of debt that we're taking on, is going to force some serious thinking over the course of coming decades and coming years. I think we're going through a period where we're going to see very big change, and these rules are going to be rewritten, and that is going to matter for us. So the recession, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but because you've got some great speakers coming up to talk to you about the detail of how this recession has unfolded. But let me show you just quickly for a bit of scene setting. On the left-hand side, you can see the first kind of big wave of job losses. And that was when the economy kind of went into lockdown. We realized that there was this big shock coming. Our borders were closed and all of that stuff was happening. And then as we came out of it, we saw the second wave of job losses. And there was very much the impact of, you know, the new reality, the new normal that we're going to probably live with for 1, 2, 3 years. And then over the course of the last few weeks, we're seeing this kind of third wave of job losses. Yes, there's a little bit of that latest restrictions, but there's also a bigger story of the underlying long recession, the slog of the third wave of the recession that's coming through. And so we are in this kind of different phases of the recession right now. This is not going to go away anytime soon. So we just need to be really mindful that for our communities and business, the recession is not over. While some of us might be getting tired of the pandemic, the reality is that the virus has not gone away and the impact of that has not gone away. On the right-hand side, you can see just where we are in terms of the spike in job losses, which is, I think, a really handy way to think about the shock that we have experienced so far. We are probably going to see at least as big a recession as we saw in the late 80s and early 90s. And a lot of you with white hair or gray hair will remember just how difficult that was. You know, there was an entire generation that found it very difficult to get their careers kickstarted. There were people in older ages that lost their jobs and were never able to get back into work, and that affected their retirement and all of those kinds of things. There were businesses that failed and they just can't recover. So we just need to be very mindful that we've still got this probably a good 18-month period coming up where we're going to see this increased need for your services. Yes, you've been working your butts off for the last 6 months, but it's not going to go away. Prepare for a marathon, because it is going to be a case where your skills and your services are going to be required for some time to come. Now, having said that, not every part of the economy is experiencing it the same way. One of the most extraordinary things for me has been just how resilient our export sector has been. Not every part, but some parts. And you can see on the left-hand side that, yes, we had that kind of drop-off in exports through that period of April, May, and June. But since then, we've seen big growth in exports. You know, it's been on things like meat exports, on fruit exports. You know, part of it has been because, you know, they can't process the meat in places like Europe and America because of, you know, the spread of COVID. But also because our food is being seen as one of our key strengths and has done really, really well over the course of the last few months, much better than I expected, which is great because it shows us just how much resilience is possible in many parts of our economy. The one thing that we did expect and has come to fruition is this big drop-off in imports. Part of it's about lower prices of fuel, but also significant reduction in imports of capital items. So businesses reducing their investment, businesses reducing their imports for on-selling to consumers. All of this is having a big impact. And what we're seeing is this, the supply chain shock that Pam talked about, that's really real. We're seeing that. But also there is just this general climate of fear where businesses and households are being cautious about investing and spending money. And this caution, more than anything else, is what a recession is. It's when people are being careful about spending, when people are scared about making big decisions. That's when things don't move very much. So it's really important that we help people make well-informed, risk-adjusted decisions, because even during a recession, there are good opportunities to be had. And as you can see with exports, for example, you know, there are many parts of our economy that are actually doing quite well right now. And it's really important we don't stop investing and stop growing our economy where we can. Now, over the course of the last 6 months, we've seen quite a lot of debate, quite a lot of, I think, a rise of misinformation. And part of it's been this kind of the story that if we stopped trying to deal with the health response, the economy would be back to normal and things would be better. This just gives you a sort of a really quick scan of where economic performance has been. This is how much, going to the left is how much their economies have shrunk in the June quarter versus a year ago, and going further up the top is how many people have died. So essentially the picture that I want to show you is that just because you killed more people doesn't mean your economy is doing better. If anything, in many cases, what we're seeing is if your health response is crap, then people are really scared of going out and dying, and they're not going out to spend and going out to invest. So it shouldn't take a genius to work this stuff out. But what you're going to find is there's going to be a lot of resistance as people get weary and tired of lockdowns and the restrictions and all those kinds of things. And yet, what we do know and what we learned from 100 years ago and all the kind of public health responses in the past is it's really important that we get the health response right. Otherwise, the economic response cannot possibly take hold. So the alternatives are not necessarily better. And when people talk about Sweden or whatever other country, I think, you got to keep it in context. We're talking about thousands of people who would have died by now. And those thousands of people are real people. They're not just statistics. Now, just parking that for a second, I think one of the things that's become very clear for me again is this emphasis on thinking local, because there is this tendency to go, oh, this is what's happening in New Zealand. Well, our regional economies are very unique. They have their own strengths and their own weaknesses, their own reliances and their own foibles. And that's exactly how it should be, because that's our place. And what we find, for example, with tourism is that if you look on the left-hand side, many parts of the North Island are very, very strong when it comes to domestic tourism. And when you look at international tourism, it's really around certain parts of the South Island that are very, very strong with it. So when we think about closed borders, not everybody is going to experience this massive contraction. Yes, it's going to have a big impact on many parts of New Zealand, but there will also be some parts of New Zealand that are really good on domestic tourism that might be able to do better or only have a small decline. So these regional perspectives and local perspectives of understanding what your strengths are, what your unique offering is in this current environment is extraordinarily important. Do not underestimate the importance of being local. So don't get too dragged down by this national New Zealand stories and the headlines that you might see. Be very focused on what's happening on the ground. Trust the information and the knowledge and insights from your local businesses and your local community. Really, really important that you don't just rely on desktops and data. Go out and talk to real people and understand what's happening on the ground. There is no substitute. And you guys can do that better than anybody else. And it's really important that you do. For me, one of the biggest and most important things through this recession has been just how adaptable our economy and our businesses have been. Yes, there have been many, many businesses that have been hurt, many people who have lost their jobs, but also at the same time, we're seeing these significant changes in the way that people work. And that's a good thing. When I'm talking to people like Microsoft and others, they're telling me that we're seeing this incredibly compressed take-up of technology. What they thought would happen over the course of next 2 years have happened over the course of the last 6 months. And whether it's the adoption of Teams or Zoom or whatever, we're seeing these different ways of working. Now, they're not perfect substitutes, but this is going to kickstart us into a much more online collaborative way of working than we have seen in the past. In the June quarter, about 1 million people worked from home, and that's about double with a normal that we would see. And we saw this going through the different stages. And what was really interesting for me was that while we saw people slowly going back to work into their offices and that kind of stuff, all the way through level 1, we saw quite a sustained period where people continued to work a little bit more from home. So it's not that lots of people stayed at home, we found more flexible ways of working. So in places like Auckland, I found during level 1 that the level of congestion was much lower than before the pandemic hit. That's because fewer people, there are some people who are choosing to work from home at least 1 or 2 days a week. And this all makes a difference. And what we're seeing is this adaptation of businesses and this flexibility and resilience that's coming through. Now, we saw this again in the latest kind of restrictions, and that's now slowly unwinding. But every time we find this experience of working online, working at home, businesses are finding different ways of doing it. And we saw this essentially over the course of the last couple of weeks. What was really surprising for me was while in the first week of the lockdown, we saw a significant drop off in things like job ads. In the second week, we saw a big bounce back. Over the course of the last week, there's been a big increase. So businesses seem to be much more resilient and much more able to respond to this particular lockdown than we had the previous time around. So that's been, for me, that's been really positive. Now, while that's been really good, not every part of New Zealand is able to participate in this. So what you can see on the left-hand side is there is a whole bunch of places in New Zealand, all these orange kind of shaded areas that have relatively low levels of internet connectivity. And that's not surprising, but what it tells us that not every part of New Zealand is able to participate in this more online way of working and living. So that has to be part of our thinking, that there are these underlying inequities in our country, whether it's in terms of access through infrastructure or through affordability. There will be parts of our community that are not able to participate in this resilience that we're seeing in this COVID world. So that paves for us, I think, a bit of a pathway of the kinds of things that we need to think about looking forward. When it comes to economic development, it's not just about giving people advice, it's also about making sure people have the means and ways of being able to work and being resilient. And, you know, most businesses are using the internet, right? So if you look on the right-hand side, 97% of businesses are using the internet in some ways, but only about less than 60% of businesses are using the internet to receive orders. Now, this is important because what we saw during the lockdown was those businesses that were able to still operate during the lockdowns, they actually did really well. Significant increases in online sales. And some of them maintained that growth, and they stuck over the course of the next few weeks and months. And so that means that they've got market share and they're able to trade differently. And so even during pandemics, we saw that the ability to have this presence, the ability to have technology was a really strong suit. If you look at right down the bottom, only 23% of businesses in 2018 offered flexible working from home. And this is again telling us that businesses are not necessarily flexible enough and not thinking ahead enough when they're thinking about resilience planning, about risk planning, and all of that kind of stuff. So when you're giving your business advice, when you're mentoring and supporting those businesses, it's really important that we take the lessons of COVID and apply it to their businesses, which goes beyond just how do you manage your business and how do you manage the downturn. It's also about how do you implement processes and systems that's going to make you flexible and resilient into the future. Now, there's been a bunch of lessons for me from the pandemic, and hear me out here because I'm going to go into some abstract territory here because I think that's going to help us frame up where the next few years are going. And the first is, I think it's all very abstract until it affects us. So we all need to think that when it comes to things like risk and resilience, these are not things that we as humans are very good at dealing with. And as a result, because we can't imagine new things, the risk doesn't feel real and we don't respond to it until it hits us in the face. And we have this incredible ability to prioritize what's right in front of us over the things that might be coming in the future. And yet we know that small resources being spent now to ensure ourselves, to make ourselves resilient, will mean that we have the ability to fear future shocks, whatever they might be, much better. But also what I found when you look across the world is that education and communication are really important. If you can explain to people why you need something, if you can convince them, if you can articulate your case well, then people will go along. You know, New Zealand had extremely high rates of compliance when it came to the lockdowns and the movement restrictions, and that really helped us enjoy those months of level 1, which were very, very strong from an economic perspective. And when I think about the importance of resilience, I think it's around the importance of resilience and collectivism. You know, there was this kind of huge trade-offs. It was presented as this kind of, we were choosing between these very difficult choices. In the end, it turned out we made the right choice in that you can not kill thousands of people and you can still have an economic outcome that is, relatively speaking, better than others. because the alternative, like I said, is not back to where we were, but the alternative is something even more grim. The collective aspect is really important. I don't know if you guys saw the article that Max wrote on The Guardian yesterday or a couple of days ago. It was all about sort of building consensus. And I think building consensus is important because that collectivism that we see is really difficult to implement if you don't have that consensus. And for you in ED, it's really important in terms of thinking about, do your shareholders or your councillors and your senior managers, do they understand what economic development is for? If that consensus is not there, it's very difficult for us to get on with doing our job, and instead we'll be fighting fires trying to justify our existence. And that is going to happen a lot because council funds are going to be under pressure, council debt is going to be under pressure, and inevitably what we're seeing around the world in terms of polarization of politics is also going to infect your councils. So it's really important we find broad support in terms of what it is that ED does and what is our value and what is our impact. Now, while you're living through it, it feels like this is going to be the biggest thing in anybody's lives. And it's true that it is going to be one of those, I think, momentous changes that we see in society. But in the scheme of things, it's going to be relatively short term. Over the course of the next few years, we're going to find treatment and we're going to find vaccines. But to me, it feels like we're passing through some sort of change in the way that we think. And the accumulation of a lot of different things are going to come to a head over the course of the next few years. And that is going to be the post-pandemic world. I think we're living through a regime change. There have been too many things that I think suggest that the current models and the current model is not right. We can't pretend that doing more of the same or tinkering on the edges of our current ways of doing economics and politics and policy is going to get substantially different answers when it comes to, say, inequality or productivity, or in terms of sustainability when it comes to climate change. And what we're seeing is that while there is a real need to change our way of thinking, in many parts of the world, we're seeing this increasing polarization of people's beliefs, and which means it's getting harder and harder to find consensus. Now, America is a very extreme case, but I think it's a case in point. It's the same kind of patterns that are affecting many parts of the world. And what you see on the top is that, the Republicans have moved more to the right over time, and the Democrats have moved more to the left over time, and it means that never the twain shall meet. And so if you don't have consensus, what we're likely to see is this flip-flop of policies and flip-flop of ideas. And that means it's very difficult for us to find that cohesive narrative that we all get behind. And yet at the same time, what we're finding is we have this vacuum of no consensus and polarization, but at the same time, we have this, I think, quite strong evidence that the current orthodoxy is degenerating. And what I mean by that is that the way that we think about controlling the economy or creating equity or efficiency, these are all things that don't seem to be working very well. In New Zealand, we haven't improved inequality in decades, and we're not the only ones, right? And as we move towards this polarization of politics, I think that is what's really going to shape the world in the future. The impact of the pandemic will end, but the underlying forces are going to be shifting over time. And one of the big shifts, of course, is geopolitical, right? The center of the global economy has been shifting over time. And in 1960, the center of the global economy was over the Atlantic, not surprising, right? Very rich countries in North America and Europe. But over time, we've seen the rise of Asia. And so the incredible muscling, incredible display of strength and political maneuvering that we've seen from China and other countries around Asia is not something that's going to end. So as we start to see this geopolitics and the economic weight shifting towards the East, we are going to find these incredible tensions in the old ways of doing things, whether it's the consensus around the social democracy, whether it's around the consensus around our global institutions, the orthodox ways of thinking about the economy, about monetary policy, about government debt. All of this stuff, I think, is under threat right now. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that we don't know what the future looks like. And when you think back, we kind of started, if you think back 100 years, pre the kind of Great Depression and that kind of stuff, it was very much laissez-faire, kind of, hands-off. Markets take charge. Governments were pretty small. It was a very different kind of economy. And then we had the Great Depression, and that was huge in terms of the impact, right? We had the Great Depression, we had the wars, and that kind of really created that kind of the social democratic consensus across the Western world. And that was really quite important, and that has stayed with us in some form over the course of the last several decades. And you can see in New Zealand, we started from nothing when it comes to social housing. Before that, it was, well, you're poor, but they were also relied on charity and other ways of dealing with poverty. But we took that role into government, and that played a really big part in our psyche and our national narrative. But it was a new narrative. And I think that's really important to understand, is you can get these big changes that accumulate and accumulate. You kind of go, this system is just not working. And then suddenly the dam breaks and something new is being created. And that's what we saw in that period post the wars and post the Great Depression. There was a new consensus that shaped a lot of what we believe today, and a lot of the institutions that we see, whether it's the UN or whether it's the organization like the WHO. Those supranational agencies were really born out of the ashes of the wars. And what we saw was there are other shocks that came along. There was the collapse of the exchange rate system when the gold standard fell apart. There were oil crises. There was stagflation. Hopefully not many of you remember this part, but it was really painful when you think about the incredible inflation that we had, very high unemployment we had. And that was really important because all of a sudden that broke our understanding of how an economy works, because we always thought that there would be a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. But when both of those things rise at the same time, we had to use different tools and different ways of doing things. And that led to essentially a very different way, again, of thinking about the economy. And that was really important. So that really sowed the seeds of the kind of shift to a new narrative around monetarism, independent central banks, neoliberalism, whatever you might like to label it, it doesn't matter. But that has really shaped the last few decades about how we think about the economy. And I think the COVID response is going to be one of those things. So we are going to see this big shift in government debt, and we're seeing this extraordinarily low in interest rates. We're going to see people asking, do we really need to pay this debt back? Isn't there a different way of doing things? And did the old ways of doing stuff really work that well? And I'll show you a couple of charts. And the first one is, we're going to be borrowing a whole bunch of money to invest in a lot of stuff, right? We'll be investing in a lot of infrastructure, and these are infrastructure and investments that will be around with us for maybe 100 years to come. But if we're locking in a different way, a certain way of doing things, and baking in our current biases and all those kinds of things, it might be that they're not the right decisions, especially if we're building and locking in carbon emissions, or living next to flood-prone zones, or next to areas that are going to experience sea level rise. These are things that are going to be really problematic. In the same context of the challenge of climate change, we know that what we have experienced in terms of emissions of decline in the last few months is what we have to do every year for the next decade if we want to keep things to 1.5 degrees. And the reason I say this is because these are the issues that are going to affect future generations a lot more, because they're actually going to be alive to live through it. They're the ones who are going to have to make decisions. And they're going to ask, why should I have to bear all the cost when you've done nothing in the last 40 years to fix this inequality that has been persistent? In New Zealand, income inequality hasn't shifted for 40 years. Or you have consigned young generations to experience declining home ownership and declining security in our economy. Why is it that we must pay? And this matters because what we are experiencing is this shift in politics, where we're going to go from boomers essentially being the majority of voters to, in the next few decades, where there will be no clear majority. There will be no clear consensus. And we're going to find the same kind of fragmentation and polarization of politics that we have seen in the past. So why am I telling you all this stuff? The reason I'm telling you this stuff is I don't know which way will it go. Are we going to see the polarization that goes towards, what's happening in America, the kind of really frightening kind of Handmaid's Tale kind of outcome? Or are we going to find a big revival of the kinds of consensus that we've built post the Second World War? It could go either way. But post-pandemic, I think this is the kind of pressure that we're going to see. It's going to be a world that is going to feel and act very different. We have for a long time focused on just adjusting existing policies. I don't think that's going to work anymore because the pressures are so big and the challenges are so big. We're going to see some changes in policies, but fundamentally, I think we're going to see some changes in goals and policies. These are really big ideas. And the reason I'm telling you this is because this frames the place that we will be working. The way that central government operates, the way that local government operates is all going to be changing. For me, it's really about focusing on what you can influence. Think, do, and be local, because that is your gig and you do it really well. Help your businesses and community to plan for long and a bumpy recovery, because that's what's going to be over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. The new normal is not written yet. Let's not pretend that we know what's going to happen. So yes, let's be strategic, but agility and responsiveness is really important. Do what you do best, which is to inform. Make sure you inform your communities, your businesses, your local officials so they can make good decisions. Do what you do best, coordinate, because you don't have the funds to do everything, but bring in the right people into the right room and communicate, because that is the thing that you can do. You can amplify the wins and the challenges of a local community. That is what I think is required. In a post-pandemic world, we have no handbook of where we're headed, but what you do have is the ability to respond. I might stop there. I think I might have gone over time, Patrick.
Just about. Thank you very much, Shamibel. That was an excellent kind of coverage from some quite significant macro issues right down to the importance of local. And as you said, we've probably used most of the time that we would have had for questions. Not that anybody have come through. I did have a few, but I'll keep them to myself. But I will make the point that obviously that message around how economic development is important, and that I think that's something which we would all acknowledge and appreciate your insight in. And then even more importantly, an economist telling us not just to rely on the data. So that's kind of some really important messages to get us kind of kicked off for this program. So look, Shamibel, conscious of time, so once again, thank you very much for your input. If any sort of subsequent thoughts and questions come through, we're recording all of these, so we may play them back to you later. But again, thanks for your time, and hopefully you can yourself enjoy some of the other sessions later in the week.
Thank you, Patrick. Everybody have a wonderful Congress.
Great, thanks. Our next speaker in this morning's program is Brad Olson, Senior Economist from Infometrics. Brad, welcome. You've been very visible to us all over the last couple of months. It's great to see you on a screen again. Unfortunately, we won't be able to have a burger and a beer like we did last conference, but it's hopefully we'll see you in face again soon. So, Brad, I'm going to go straight over to you as we've used a couple of extra minutes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. Kia ora, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. After being told that perhaps listening to the data isn't fully the right move, I am going to spend all of my time talking about data. But that's also because, look, the economic effects of COVID-19 are hitting New Zealand very, very differently. And we've got to understand those more regional effects to understand how to best respond and how to coordinate those local response plans. So without further ado, I will share my presentation, something I prepared earlier, and go through some of these. And I am going to try and leave a bit of time for questions. So Patrick, feel free to stop me if I start to go too far over time or into time. But like I said, what we are seeing throughout this pandemic is quite a different shift. Now, there's been a lot of talk around forecasts, and look, we here at Infometrics have done quite a few of those ourselves. What I do want to show you today, though, is some of the key numbers that we've seen coming through in reality to highlight just how different we have seen the shock play out. Now, without getting too simplistic, there are three key drivers of how we see economic activity playing out and have played out so far across the New Zealand economy. The first one is looking at the food-based primary sector. So our exports are still performing well, and I'll show you some numbers on those soon. The world needs to eat, and we're able to provide it. So those economies that do have a strong bias or concentration around food-based manufacturing or agriculture are certainly in a better position moving forward. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got tourism. Of course, everyone already understands that tourism is in a very harsh place. From 4 million tourists a year to nothing is always going to be a rude shock to the system, and we have seen that reverberate throughout the domestic economy already. Sure, there is the great New Zealand roadie that seems to be going back on, people going across New Zealand and exploring their own backyard, but the numbers just simply don't stack up in terms of filling that void that international tourists will have left, and so that is a major decline in the economy. We're seeing construction coming through a little bit in the middle. On one hand, the likes of non-residential and residential construction is set to fall, and we've already seen some early signs of that, particularly in the non-residential space. Yet we've got infrastructure and these shovel-ready projects that are being lauded as a key part of development across the country. Again, what we're expecting there is that construction will be a key part of getting us out of this economic hole, but there may well be a lull between when construction dips and when some of those shovel-ready infrastructure projects start to come through. The wild card for some regions, as I've put down the bottom, is some of those key regional employers, particularly manufacturing, which are in a harder place and will have some very, I guess, direct impacts on certain areas. I think of the likes of Tiwai shutting down at the bottom of the South Island, Marsden Point Refinery in Whangarei, and the likes of the Glenbrook Smelter, steel works and the likes of sort of South Auckland, Northern Waikato. Those are going to have very, very localized regional economic impacts. But what have we seen so far? And this is very much in line with what we were thinking, but also stark to see it play out in front of us. Over the June 2020 quarter, we did see quite a diverse economic impact. By Infometrics' reckoning, around about 12% of normal economic output was lost. More of that was coming through in the likes of Otago. Queenstown, of course, a key part of that, down around 26% in Queenstown alone. Although on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the likes of Manawatu-Wanganui region and Gisborne-Tairāwhiti, which have come through better. Now, what we are seeing play out here throughout this list is those areas that have a strong tourism bias without a strong primary sector as well are taking the hit a bit harder alongside some of our more urbanised centres. Those areas that have a greater focus on the likes of our primary sector, agriculture and similar, and who don't have a strong tourism focus, the likes of Tairāwhiti is a key one there, have been able to weather the storm better than other regions might have. And you can see some in the middle, the likes of Canterbury, Taranaki and Waikato, a bit more balanced in terms of having both of those key factors, and so relatively balanced throughout the middle. Again, that gets even more stark when we look at it by local council area. You can see the likes of Queenstown, Mackenzie, Kaikoura, three hardest hit local areas. Again, not going to be surprising for anyone on this call, but the reality of this is a very stark graph. What you can also see throughout this bottom half is that it's both tourism and urban focused. You see the likes of Dunedin, Hamilton, Tauranga, Wellington all coming through. Auckland's around about 13th from the bottom, just for reference. And so that highlights as well that there is this hit, particularly to those urban centres where a lot of office jobs are, but when we're all working from home, we have seen a shift coming through. The likes of Wairoa, Tararua, Carterton, South Wairarapa, all of these areas, both with a strong agri focus, but also without a strong focus on the likes of tourism, particularly international tourism coming through. And you can see that down the list as well. Kaipara was one of the most open economies by our reckoning throughout lockdown, and so they were able to weather the storm better. But again, that range shows that, you know, Wairoa with a minus 4.2% drop through to Queenstown with a 26% drop, the differences are widely felt, but felt in very, very different ways. And so the response is going to be quite different as well moving ahead. As I said, that primary sector is going really well for New Zealand. The world needs to eat and we're able to provide it. We've got some very high quality goods and we're renowned for those. People are, of course, looking for those sorts of healthy goods. The likes of kiwi fruit, for example, a great vitamin C hit. People across the globe trying to keep their vitamin C levels up to try and ward off any sort of bugs they might get. At the same time, you've had China, which has said to their people, look, if you can drink 300 mils of milk a day, you're doing really really well. So you can see that in the graph here, the likes of fruit up in a considerably stronger position, the likes of dairy still up, and even meat, which is often focused a little bit more on the likes of the restaurant market, which has dipped. We have been able to reposition some of those exports moving ahead. So that primary sector is still earning money. That's getting money back into the local economy. And so that's why we're seeing particularly those provincial areas in a slightly stronger position moving ahead. But let's be realistic. We are still seeing an incredible economic shock coming through from COVID-19. Since March 20, just before lockdown started, nearly 75,000 Kiwis have gone on to some sort of government income support, be it job seeker support or the COVID income relief payment. Now that's more in 5 months than the entire hit during the GFC. During the GFC, it took us 21 months to add on 65,000 additional people. We did then around about 4 with COVID-19, and we will continue to see more coming through. We're still expecting you could well see over 200,000 people lose their roles as we continue to roll through this pandemic. Of course, people are just simply not spending to the same level. Businesses are not quite as encouraged to hire new people, and that is going to reverberate for a while longer. We're expecting this sort of uptick to continue for a while, with particular concentrations around the likes of November and into next year once the Christmas rush has moved through. But again, how that is playing out across the economy and what the drivers are does mean we need to take all of these numbers with a bit of thought in terms of what the appropriate response is. If we look at the growth in job seeker and CIRP in July compared to the same time last year, you can see again that divergence. The likes of Manawatu, Wanganui, Tairāwhiti, Gisborne are in a stronger position. The likes of Northland coming in fourth, not the highest increase, but if you look at the proportion of the population being supported by a government benefit, the North is the top area. And so again, that requires a different response. Not as many people have lost jobs immediately, but the wider potential labour pool and need to get people into work remains just as important in Te Tai Tokoro than the rest of the country is. The likes of Tasman with the highest actually coming off a very low base, so don't read too much into these wild annual percentage changes. The likes of Canterbury, though, an area of concern in terms of how many people have gone on that have lost jobs, particularly in those tourism-related areas. Otago, not quite as strong as probably a lot of people might have thought. And again, reading into that, what you're seeing there is a number of people who have lost jobs but are not New Zealand residents, and so therefore not able to access some of the government support that we've been seeing come through. And again, that highlights that when we talk about the response, there is a real need to understand what that means and how to best position support. I was down in Queenstown 2 weeks ago and talking to Mayor Jim Bolt. It was quite clear that there was additional work, not only to support those who are in current employment and are doing it tough. We have seen people take pay cuts or who are working fewer hours, but also important that where there are regional opportunities, that there is strong regional coordination to get people back into work rather than focusing too much on each local area. Again, we start to see that play out in the likes of the Hawke's Bay, Waikato and Wellington as well. Just 3 places that I've talked to people in the last week or so about how those changes are playing out. We know, for example, as well, and one of the changes that you can't see on your screen here is also who's being affected. We know that particularly young people and particularly women are seeing their job losses creep up much higher than other groups, and so that's of concern as well when we think of how we get New Zealand into a better position into the future. How we strengthen our employment opportunities does require us to focus a lot more on those people and what skills they have. I noted in the first slide that construction was going to be a key example of an area that needed a bit more focus. Those shovel-ready projects are great to keep the construction sector that we currently have in employment, but if we have thousands of particularly young women who are losing their jobs in retail and hospitality, it might not be that they immediately become bridge builders overnight. And so again, when we think about how we redeploy people and where we need to retrain and upskill people, it's not always those classic interventions that we might have studied in our economics textbooks. And as a young person myself and talking to friends who are in that position, that has never been more clear. What is also interesting is that we will not be able to fill some of our skilled labour gaps that we usually do from overseas like normal. However, we do still have a pool of people who are remaining in New Zealand who haven't yet made it out, and where those people are, again, becomes more important than ever. This is some estimates from Stats NZ that highlights where those remaining travellers in New Zealand still are. Auckland gets the lion's share, around about half of them. But interesting focuses that you might want to pick out, the likes of Marlborough having a slightly oversized share of those remaining travellers. We've seen a lot of people sticking around post-lockdown to help with the likes of the harvest and similar. Beforehand, we had quite a concentration in the Bay of Plenty that slipped back a touch, but again, helping with some of the production and the fruit sector this year. Waikato has also seen a bit of an increase in recent weeks in terms of the number of people that are in the region who otherwise we might have expected to go home. All of those changes mean that the labour market dynamics are as fluid as ever. We've got fewer people working, we've got people working fewer hours, we've got probably an even greater skills mismatch moving forward, and we don't have that overseas skilled labour that we'd normally bring in, but we do have some Kiwis that are returning as well, and so all of these different factors together are making it very difficult to get a read and to design those interventions. But I did want to highlight this sort of information because it will be, in my mind, useful to help fill out that conversation of what people you have, what resources you might need to deploy, and where that goes from a labour market perspective. As well as that, and I do want to sort of focus a little bit at this point on where we go to next from an economic point of view and what that means for the regions. Now, we have seen a focus once we've got out of lockdown on two things. One, everyone like me had to learn how to cook during lockdown, and so that focus on hospitality has dampened somewhat. People are not spending the same amount out on cafes or lunches as they might have previously, and so again, how people consume is changing. Uber Eats and those sort of delivery services, even delivery of groceries generally, has increased quite a lot, and so people are obviously opting for that. At the same time, we've seen a fair bit of sort of DIY home renovations and some changes to home and recreation that's coming through. A lot of people sitting there for 4.5 weeks wanting to think about a new couch, perhaps looking out, realizing they haven't done that deck that they've been meaning to do for years. And so we have seen some changes coming through in terms of people's spending and consumption patterns. And I think that's quite worthwhile to keep a focus on as we move forward. Those changes are likely to persist for a while. The likes of that shift towards food and liquor and groceries is likely to be sustained. That DIY also presents opportunities for us to do a little bit more building, but perhaps not at the greater scale, and again reinforces that although households do still have money in their back pockets, that's not all going on domestic tourism as some people would like to see. We're seeing actually that money is being split between domestic tourism, between vehicles, for example, people buying new cars, and also on some of those home renovations without the ability to go overseas. What we're also seeing is that the resurgence from COVID-19 in recent weeks has been different again to how the economic effects are playing out across New Zealand. Auckland, funnily enough, taking the largest hit from that level 3 reduction, around about 44-45% the first week, coming back a touch in the week to 30 August. What we have seen as well is that has damaged some supply chains and meant that some regions are in a tougher position. The likes of the Auckland-Waikato border, of course, difficult to get some people from where they live to where they work and vice versa, and the likes of Northland becoming an isolated region in its own right, all the way up to the top of New Zealand. What we can also see, though, is that where those bits of resilience are coming through, Northland's still coming out with a pretty positive spending figure. Obviously, locals are going, look, we need to back our own, and so they have started to keep that money flowing around the domestic economy. That is, of course, what we're seeing across a lot of different parts of New Zealand. Otago losing out again from the Auckland lockdown with the likes of that tourism spend decreased. What was interesting is to see Wellington in that third place. Now, this is not quite as pronounced in the last week we have data for, but if I showed you the data for 23 August, it would be quite sizable, and what that showed was a number of people in both the public and private sector who immediately went back to working from home. And so the struggle for a lot of economies, regional economies moving forward, is how to deal with not only that shifting labour market in terms of who's got work, who doesn't, and who's coming in, but also where that work is and where people are living. That is a dynamic that we expect to see changing over time. That's quite clear in terms of some of the working from home figures that we've seen. And I wanted to profile here on this graph 3 of the major urban centres, if you will, Wellington, Hamilton, Auckland, and 3 more provincial centres that all have a little bit of difference to them, Waipā District, Lower Hutt, and Queenstown. Now you can see Queenstown here hit because of that tourism element with a severe lack of activity. Auckland taking a hit as well with the likes of the latest lockdown. But if you look at the likes of Auckland, Wellington and Hamilton, you can see that the spending hit throughout the lockdown period was equally as harsh, down around about 60%, and hasn't really gotten all that much better in recent times. Still struggling, apart from Hamilton, to really get above what would be a normal level of spending. The likes of Waipā and Lower Hutt, though, in a much stronger position, up around sort of 10% throughout most of the period. We are seeing that people are working from home more. Now, that doesn't mean that people are completely leaving the urban centres. It does reinforce, though, talking to a number of businesses across New Zealand, that urban-suburban divide is real. And what we are seeing is, instead of someone taking their 5 days a week in the office and turning that into 5 days a week at home, they may well be switching to, say, 3 days a week at home, 2 days a week in the office. That is allowing for greater commutes, but it is also changing those spending patterns, and is a factor that regional economies are going to have to grapple with when we look at where people are working, what services are provided, and at what times and what places those services move through. We signalled this right at the start, that working from home was likely to be an area of focus. I didn't think it would come through quite so quickly. What we are hearing from businesses is that there will be a rollout period over a number of years, but there are quite a few people who have immediately decided that working from home is an option that they can work with. And what I will highlight is that my expectation is, as we continue to have COVID-19 in the community, more people will be working from home. And certainly if we continue to yo-yo throughout alert levels, that will see more people being kept at home and away from their office, just because it makes more sense to have one grounded place of operations where they can start to create a bit more of a routine moving forward. So look, there are a lot of challenges in the economy. As you saw, there's quite a lot of difference in terms of those regional hits, the likes of the primary sector helping some areas move through this as best as possible. Those in a tourism sense hit a lot harder, and I think for those tourism focused operators and localities, we are going to see a shift, not only in terms of a change in the economic diversification, but also in terms of what those tourism offerings are. Construction playing a bit of a wild card through the middle, some lower activity expected for the likes of residential and non-residential activity, but infrastructure and those shovel-ready projects providing a bit more stimulus underneath. The timeframes, however, remain a point of caution. We're also going to see more of that change around the urban versus suburban divide, where people work and what work they do and what resources they need to do that work will become important in terms of planning and providing services out to the community, and also from an economic development point of view of trying to attract some different operators into a local area, and again changing that dynamic of how a local economy works. This is probably one of the more fundamental shifts, because it has accelerated and really push the button on some of those changes we'd already seen. We know that people had already been working from home to a point, and then been more online deliveries and online selling. This COVID-19 pandemic has pushed the button on moving those into supercharge. We have seen more people starting to operate in those different regards. We are still, though, going to see an incredible hit on the economy. The latest forecasts from Infometrics highlight that we still expect unemployment will get higher. As I said, still around 200,000 people losing their jobs is what we are fearful of, and that will reverberate for a longer period of time. You can see in our orange line here, it takes a lot longer to track back, and that's essentially because we are expecting that as the economy readjusts, as we see some of these structural changes move through, people are not going to be able to find roles quite as easily. There is going to be a period of retraining and upskilling for people to move into those different areas, and it will take a while for that activity to start to rebound. So our expectation is that this hit does reverberate for a longer period of time before things get back towards normal. That's me for the moment, Patrick. I do want to bring you back in and leave a few times a few questions if you have any, or if there are any points you want me to pick up on a little bit more as well.
Thanks very much for that, Brad. It's really great to see kind of how your thinking's evolving at Infometrics as you start looking at kind of some of the data. I think it's some really important messages for us there as economic developers in terms of how the different industrial structures are leading to different regional sort of outcomes, which obviously means we also need quite tailored local responses, which is kind of a key responsibility of the economic development community working within those national frameworks. Couple of things kind of coming through. I think one of them, which has come from Miles Dalton, which you might want to comment on, is recognizing that when we're looking at the impacts, particularly when we're looking at them on a percentage basis, it can be quite different when you look at absolute numbers. You know, if you're starting from a small base and you see a large increase, it may only be a small number of people that are affected. And I'm just wondering, from some of the work that you've done, when you start to look at the absolute impacts in certain areas, are there any other different or interesting patterns that kind of emerge?
Absolutely, and look, it's a very valid question. The likes of Tasman region, for example, I think having the highest increase in job seeker numbers, but again coming off a very low base. So that's a case in point. Also noting that the likes of Tasman region was one of the best performing economies prior to COVID, and so what you're seeing there is sort of going from a very speedy point to just a bit lower is going to show up a lot more than going from slow to a little bit slower again. Again, that difference, and I highlight my home area of Northland without a massive percentage increase, Patrick, but quite a large base of people. So those challenges are certainly quite real. I think we realised that difference, if you will, between changes and the absolutes, particularly with the Auckland lockdown. You know, that's 38% of the economy, and so that did have quite a large economic gravitational pull, if you will, around the absolutes. Certainly what we're seeing is those urban centres are concentrated areas where you've got both a reduction in terms of travel, people are not moving about, be it for business or tourism activities, but also that shift in where people are moving to means that the spread out is more diverse. If you look at the likes of Wellington, for example, Wellington City is a key employment hub, but if you look at where those workers live, it's not any one area. It's more spread out. It's the likes of Kapiti, Porirua, both parts of the Hutt, and all the way over in Wairarapa. So you're spreading a bigger concentration out, and so you do start to see, I guess, a bit of an increase in each of those other areas, but a massive, much larger reduction in Wellington. So it's absolutely a point that we bear in mind. The question also becomes, if we show levels, we often have to strip out Auckland. It's just so large. But yeah, we're certainly seeing those differences coming through, particularly that high-low base element.
Yeah, and I think that reinforces the need for us as economic development professionals, something which also Shamubel spoke about in terms of understanding the kind of impact on our areas and what's going to make the difference, you know, what sort of impacts are, how they're going to play through, and being close to the ground. And I guess the question that I'd have for you around that is that requires places to respond flexibly and within a framework which is still quite centralized in terms of national policy settings. And if we think about how economic development is delivered in New Zealand within that sort of national framework, and then the need for local flexibility, do you think there's anything that's sort of emerging through COVID which either changes how we're currently approaching those issues?
I think, I mean, it's interesting, and this is the point that I've been trying to make to central government decision makers, both ministries and elected members and such, is that actually, you know, there are many ways that you can try and address this issue. You can try and address it through, say, a gender lens first, if you want, or an industry lens or a regional lens. And I've said to everyone that a regional lens is important first and foremost, because you can try and get the construction sector, say, back up and running, but if you've got got a huge amount of activity already going in Wellington and not a lot happening in Northland, for example, you know, the way you have to interact is quite different. So a regional first approach allows for that sort of dynamism. What I think we have seen that's changed quite a bit is the response from local agencies. There's always a lot going on in the ED space, as I'm sure everyone here will know. What I think's been really quite impressive through this is the coordination that we've seen. We've seen local councils, EDAs, chambers of commerce, everyone has come out, and instead of trying to do any patch protection, you know, I'm dealing with these businesses, you know, stay out of my way. It's been, look, let's come together and form a very comprehensive way forward so that when they do, you know, when regions are talking to central government, that those more regional plans are able to be made fast and with full knowledge. And that is actually a real difference that we're seeing through this pandemic that we haven't seen as much before. So that's quite encouraging moving forward.
Great. Brad, thank you very much for your time today. We're backed into the next presentation, and it was really great to get your inputs and insights. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Benji Patterson, another one of our leading economists in New Zealand, who's been very insightful in thinking about the impacts of kind of COVID. Benji's going to talk to us about measuring the impact of COVID-19. Benji, I don't know if you picked up my earlier points. What I'll do is I'll come back in 5 minutes or so before the end of your presentation, turn my camera back on so you can see you're coming to the end. And then if there's any questions that are coming through, I'll help put them back to you. So Benji, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Great, thanks for that, Patrick. I trust that you can all hear me. Look, kia ora everyone. Good morning to all my fellow economic development professionals, and thanks Susan for pulling together this, this conference. It's been really great getting to hear Pam speak, and then Shamabeel, and then my former colleague there, Brad, talking about what's happening, both in terms of where we may be heading and what's actually happening on the ground in the data. So I must admit, it's a bit weird for me to be delivering this presentation this morning from my spare room. It's not just that I'm not wearing any pants. I mean, that's pretty good. It's more about when I reflect on this conference from a year ago. So here I am a year ago, excited and ready to go to the gala dinner at the wonderful Omaka Aviation Heritage Centre in Blenheim. Now, what a wonderful evening that was. We're recognising the achievements of economic development professionals across New Zealand, and we were also congratulating our first cohort of accredited economic developers through EDNZ's professional development program. And that's something for which I've proudly been a learning facilitator. So I guess at least the only memory I can have of Marlborough's conference is I do have some salve in the fridge to quaff down after this presentation's done and dusted. So what a ride we've been on over the past 6 months. And we have no idea how much longer this will all go on. This uncertainty is unsettling for an economist who used to love nothing more than dusting out his old crystal ball. But sadly, I've had to learn long ago that a crystal ball is it's a pretty shit tool, to be honest with you. And narrowly conjecturing about a single future state of the world, that's a fool's game. So over recent months, I've reflected a lot that the inclusive growth agenda that we talked so much about last year, that's now even more relevant than it ever was before. Crises affect different groups of people in society disproportionately. What you typically see is that existing vulnerabilities, inequalities, and distributional distortions are exacerbated. So youth are hurt more than older workers. Māori and Pacifica, they typically fare worse than Pākehā, and women are more affected than men. Now, I care about these issues. People are at the centre of my practice in regional economics, and it's unsettling to see how the current crisis is affecting so many individuals' lives, their mental health and their well-being. And the legacy of these problems, it's going to linger. And even if we're not looking about people and we're putting more of a hard-nosed economic attitude onto things, productivity, it'll be affected by people having long periods outside the labour force. So skills development and helping those people transition is very important. But one of the things we're going to see is these gaps between the haves and the have-nots. They can become more pronounced as ownership and of capital and property. They often become more concentrated during crises such as these. And following the global financial crisis, or GFC as it's known, these tensions, they manifested in the Walk on Wall Street movement. So this time round, we need to not just focus on recovery, but consistent with an inclusive growth agenda, we must focus from the start on delivering an inclusive recovery. So to deliver this inclusivity and to properly target resources and actions, we need to have good data. And I know Shamabeel, said there's pitfalls with that, but we do need to have evidence to help us identify who, as well as to track and reflect on what we're doing. So data is usually a challenge in a regional environment, particularly if you're looking at things to a territorial authority level of detail. But now more than ever before, we need more data, and we expect more out of it. So we need it to be timely. The world's changing so rapidly, and we can't wait to find out what has occurred months down the track. We need those insights to be deeper. We need a certain granularity that allows us to cut insight in different directions. We need to know about different places across multiple aspects of the lives of businesses and households alike. We need to be able to segment what is happening to focus in on problem areas with targeted responses. But very importantly, and I think this cuts to some of what Shamabeel was saying, we also need to understand what is happening now, how it may be changing behaviour. And part of the reason for those shitty wee crystal balls that they're not working is that we're facing something we haven't been through in the modern era. We don't have a data set that we can look at and say, hey, this is how people reacted last time, this is how they'll react this time. Instead, we have to find ways of assessing how the crisis changes patterns of behaviour, how people consume, how businesses operate, and what supply chains look like. These structural changes in behaviour, they'll leave a lasting legacy on our economies if they endure. So today I'm going to walk you through some of my thoughts of these data needs. I'm going to talk you through the types of insight needed as we progress through the crisis, and how some information gaps are being filled by an incredible period of innovation by data providers. Also highlight to you gaps I believe remain in areas where local economic development professionals, that they need to take ownership of gathering their own insight. So many months ago, I guess I began to think about what on earth is COVID to me as an economist? How does it compare with other crises? How can I conceptualize the problem? So when considering the pandemic, we initially drew parallels. When I say we, I mean the profession of economics. We initially drew parallels with market disruptions following the GFC. But this time is different. From early on in the crisis, as markets began to lock up and then borders closed across the globe, I began to think of COVID-19 as a crisis trifecta. So first and foremost, it was a public health crisis where policy responses to protect lives, so they stopped the usual functioning of the economy in its tracks, and they disrupted financial markets. So the economic fallout from the GFC, on the other hand, it wasn't the sudden abrupt stoppage. It was the result of businesses and households gradually altering their behaviour in response to strife in financial and banking markets. So the GFC, it lingered for a long time, but it never completely halted the functioning in the same way that is happening under the current crisis. So thankfully for now, the incredible responses by policymakers across each of the corners of this triangle, they've warded off the worst for us. Public health speaks for itself. The Reserve Bank has pumped money into the system and prevented credit from locking up, while the fiscal response that included wage subsidies and public investment, it's kept activity up in the economy. Of course, we can argue whether the balance has been right at all times, but by and large, we've prevented the worst outcomes of each of these domains. So GFC parallels, they're not going to get us very far when we look to the COVID recovery. After the GFC, we just wanted confidence to return and credit to begin flowing so that we could get back to business. This time around, we've endured so much. Our liberties have been taken away from us. Our businesses have not been allowed to do what they usually do. And very crucially, we've been worried about our health and that of our loved ones. So I begin to think of the crisis with this uncertainty as three major phases. We don't know when it will clear up. It's as simple as that. The public health experts, they're telling us what needs to happen, but even they don't know when or precisely how that's going to occur. And the same goes in the economy. So my view is that we'll have three phases, and there could be some cycling between them. We have our triaging, surviving under shutdown. Recovery, when we begin to get that sugar rush, when we begin to return to some sense of normality, and then eventually where we end up, the new normal. And what does that new world look like? So the triaging phase, we thought we were through it, but recently we cycled back to it. So fingers crossed for no more flare-ups. This stage is about public health measures to prevent community transmission of the virus, and that causes sharp and severe economic effects as many parts of the economy shut down. Businesses and households in this state of the world, they have to use coping mechanisms to get by, but they do need additional support, and that's what we've seen. Then we move on to the recovery phase at some point as the virus is brought under control, either through public health measures, medical progress. And at that stage, the economy begins to resume growth. And we did see that, you know, for a period of time before we went back into lockdown type measures and a net re-escalation of the alert levels. So once this recovery is entrenched, and there may be false starts, as we've seen, it will be characterised by some sort of growing confidence and the need to just get stuff done. And I thought it was quite amazing how we saw businesses flourish and readjust to the new world as they came out of lockdown last time round. But it was quite interesting to see how quickly things could revert. And I mean, you know, it was interesting, for example, looking at the airlines in New Zealand, looking at how Air New Zealand and even Jetstar, they got their mojo back, began flying everywhere, only to have to trim their operations again in response to what was happening. But then I guess that response to what is happening is where we begin to think about this new normal. And economists have struggled most with this phase as it's so unknown. So as consumer and business behaviours have gone through such dramatic changes during the crisis, the nature of demand, of the preferences of consumers, of businesses, of their business practice, their supply chain, these are likely to structurally change. And the real key thing is these changes, they'll be inconsistent across industries, and that'll present some sectors and some places with greater opportunities, while others, they'll need to evolve or they'll cease to exist. So it's fundamental not just to focus on the immediate and recovery phase, but to understand how what has happened might be a catalyst for broader long-term transformation. So when we reflect on moving on through these crisis phases, economists have used a lot of letters to describe their expected shape of the economic recovery. A V, a U, a W, an L, or a K, which I actually kind of like, which is about exacerbating these inequalities. You know, if we think about a V, well, in the early stages of the crisis, Treasury was very quick to signal a V, but anyone could see that their model, it wasn't realistic, as it was simply premised on the same old model of, to get a little bit of an economic wonk for a second, mean reversion. So whenever you depart from the norm, you revert back to it. The bigger the fall, the bigger the rise. So the sort of model they were using was not one that could allow for these structural changes in behaviour. So it's clear that a V is a silly letter, but I'm also unconvinced by the other letters thrown at me for the economic outlook. The problem is we don't actually even know what one is happening until we're well down that path. So I think it's counterproductive to focus on the shape of recovery and instead strip things back to people and businesses and think about what their situation and thought processes are like. And from that, we can begin to build scenarios that allow us to think about the entire risk spectrum we're facing. So for people, you know, it's thinking about things like how have people's economic situations changed and how is their behaviour reacting? You know, are they going to move around New Zealand to look for work? Are they, when they stay at home, does that mean they're consuming more in the commuter belt rather than the CBD, etc.? Businesses, well, how are businesses in different industries affected and how are they reacting? You know, we hear a lot about the pain that businesses are going through, but are people starting up businesses or are they just all closing? So when I've mined through data from the company's office, I've actually seen that startup rates have been surprisingly high, even during lockdown, because people have made the best of their situation to exploit opportunities created by this change. We haven't yet seen many closures come through. Those will only slowly begin to emerge. So I said before that we do need good data. So it is key to put people and businesses back in the core, but the shifting of focus isn't enough. So we do need to be able to monitor as regularly as possible to reflect on what we are doing and how things are unfolding. And thankfully, data providers have risen to meet the challenge of this intensified demand for insight. And what has been a surprise to me is that the public sector has been among the most innovative in this space, not the bunch that you'd usually expect or associate with innovation. And this hasn't always been the case. And trust me, I know. I made a good living for years as a data peddler, filling in gaps in regional information that wasn't adequately provided in the right format by the public sector. But there's nothing like a crisis to get the best out of these public institutions. They've risen to the challenge, taken risks, and mined their administrative data sets in progressive ways, which they've then delivered through innovative dashboards. Look, there are too many innovations to go through in this short presentation, but here are just a few selected examples. So Stats New Zealand, among their innovations, they've begun releasing jobs data using payday filings. So you can get that to territorial, to regional level each month. There's weekly trade data that we've already seen a couple of the other economists bring out. And there's also a COVID dashboard. In this data, it's taught me things like that jobs, they fell steeply during April, but most places have regained some lost ground since. I know from that the wage subsidies are working. I've also learnt that we're running a record trade surplus, which is helping me understand why provincial economies are so resilient at present. If we think about MSD, well, we're getting from their administrative records now weekly benefits data, and we're getting that to a territorial authority level of detail each month. I can see that in my hometown here in Queenstown, that job seeker support, it's up about 6-fold off a very low base, but many other provincial centres are up by smaller amounts. I also can see in the data that youth are heavily affected, as I've feared they would be. MB, one of the great things that they've done is they've brokered a deal with a private card spending provider to release weekly retail spending statistics for territorial authorities to the public. You see in that data the initial sugar rush, how it has waned in some places, but it's continued in others. You see that there's particular strength in spending in weekend getaways that are close to the main centres. So places like the Coromandel, the Wairarapa and Hamner. Some of these are all having record winters. And then Data Ventures, who is the mysterious commercial arm of Statistics New Zealand. And what they've done is they've used mobile phone records to monitor population in very small geographies. And interestingly for me is the sort of data that they're mining, it's something the private sector, they failed over many years to effectively get out there and for people to trust. So the data that Data Ventures has put out has highlighted to me just how well we adhered to lockdown, but also how quick we were to return to our favourite haunts as soon as we were allowed to. We also see how startling the domestic tourism trends have been. And when I couple that with retail data, I can see that in some places there were a lot more people, but they were spending less for each person. So we had situations there where it wasn't just because you were replacing with a domestic traveller, it wasn't like for like with the international visitor. But despite all this innovation, there are things that we're struggling to see. The new data, it's allowed us to see outcomes in the initial crisis and its recovery phase to date, but it's insufficient for all situations. There are some gaps and distortions. You know, for example, because of all this government support, which has helped shore up jobs via the wage subsidies, it's puffed up some outcomes, particularly when it comes to jobs and when it comes to some of the spending statistics. We've put bandages over bandages, and we have no idea what the wounds look like underneath when we rip them off. So we do still need to find deeper ways of learning about what households and businesses' bank accounts and their balance sheets really look like. And that's for different groupings of people in different parts of the country. You know, there's also work needed to do things like match up the wage subsidies with business locations, and to learn about other issues, like if businesses' invoices are being paid, where mortgage holidays are most prevalent, etc. And aside from these gaps in the here and now, we also need to reflect, as I've already hammered home, whether the economy will have permanent structural changes. And we want to know if behaviours are evolving as a result of the crisis in ways that we have not seen before. So thinking about that structural change, that's where some local solutions can help come in and fill the gaps. So if we go back and reflect on my 3 phases of the crisis, reflecting on structural change and the evolving behaviour of households and of businesses, that was the 3rd phase, the new normal. The question is, how do we find out about this 3rd phase when I said the economist's crystal ball doesn't work? So the lockdown joke was that the first week was Zoom, Zoom, Zoom. Bit familiar that now. And then the second one was survey, survey, survey. So we hear a lot about survey fatigue as a result, but we were surveying because we realized there are so many things we don't know and so many things we must find out from simply asking people about their thinking. We're not bloody mind readers. I know that people may say and do different things, but we do need to have targeted, intentional ways of finding out from people and businesses how their behaviours are evolving. The value of qualitative insight should not be underestimated. Targeted surveys to very specific groups of people still have their place, and so don't shy away from them completely. It's just obviously you should be wary of simply dumping generic survey after generic survey on your business database. Look, in terms of targeted surveys, a recent example I've come across here in Queenstown is that we know there are huge job losses here from the tourism sector, particularly, but we also know there is a lot of opportunities in neighbouring places like Central Otago in the horticultural sector, so fruit picking, for example. So we know that people previously haven't been willing to do these jobs, and usually migrant workers would fill them. But in the current situation, we want to find out what barriers there are to getting locals into the sector, and if there are policy responses that can help lessen these barriers and match people into employment. So the 2 councils have teamed up to ask people about this. And, you know, discovering these barriers requires finding out directly from people who are in that situation. It's also worth remembering that surveying is not the only way to gather qualitative insight in your local area. At other times, you may wish to pull together focus groups of key stakeholders in different sectors or in other aspects of your local economy and have a focused discussion about what they are seeing, what they are expecting for their own situations, and how they are intending on reacting. Economic development agencies can play a lead role in facilitating these types of conversations in ways that economists can't. It's not just about fact gathering. There is also a pastoral care element where you listen to others and may also be able to connect them in with support that is available. So just to wrap things up and keep on time, the main point is whether you survey, whether you talk to your stakeholders, or even if you just keep abreast of relevant research from others. Be inquisitive and open-minded about a future that may have very different patterns of behaviour and of supply and demand than previously. You want to keep ahead of these behavioural shifts as much as possible so that you can factor change into your crisis recovery responses. The last thing you want is to be too wedded to an economist's fancy letter interpretation of the economy. This isn't a V, guys. And to conclude, by drawing you back to my earlier discussions, you always have to be able to orientate yourself as you progress. And for that, you need regular monitoring of timely, granular regional data. You are going to have people constantly knocking on your door trying to sell you data. And the irony of me raising this isn't lost on me. But I urge you to think twice when pitched a brand new product and realize that the issue isn't necessarily of getting your hands on data that's been made easier perhaps by public sector innovation. You don't always need to spend the big bucks on getting the insight, but you do need to put your resource focus on interpreting it, on understanding what it means for your local area, and if there are any gaps, you need to think about how you can fill them with local insight so that you can help yourself. Cool. Thank you very much. I'm happy to have any questions if there are.
Thanks very much, Benji. And I think it's quite interesting, some kind of common themes coming through in all of the economists this morning. We're talking a lot about the data being important and, we need to understand, but we also need to add that level of insight and local knowledge. And I think there are sort of key messages there that don't underestimate the importance of having good data, but as you've said, really understanding what it means and interpreting it in the local level. There was one sort of question which kind of came through, and I'll sort of try and extend it a little bit. So someone's asked, Angela's Rules asked about how do we measure online sales as well as the information that's coming through from Paymark. And I guess I'd extend that a little bit to say, you talked about some of the data innovations that are out there, but from your perspective, are there key dimensions that we still don't know enough about where we're not seeing good data come through, and what might be some of the solutions to that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question about online. Unfortunately, with any regional data, we're usually mining some form of administrative data set rather than surveying, and so you have to leave a footprint. With online retailing, the consumer does at times leave a footprint, so you can see from card transactions the amount of online transacting that is happening by people from different areas. But in terms of businesses and how well businesses are faring from an online perspective, it's much more difficult to get your hands on that insight. In terms of gaps, it's really that next level that I'm missing. And I talked about Band-Aids being put over Band-Aids, so not seeing the wounds below. We're really missing an understanding of what individual households' balance sheets look like, what their bank accounts look like, how depleted they are, and also from a business perspective, some of those sort of things are being missed, and that's really important to seeing how resilient people are going to be, and I guess how much gas they've got left in the tank to get through and weather the storm before things normalise. And I guess just to bring back to my earlier comments, those differences will be very uneven across different groups of people in different sectors and in different parts of the country. So granularity.
And I think that also reinforces one of the points you made at the outset in terms of Economic Development New Zealand. We've been talking about an inclusive growth agenda now for a few years, and it's becoming more and more important. And as the differential impacts of COVID-19 start to play out, it again reinforces the need for that focus. And as you've sort of indicated, our crystal balls aren't enough to get us there. And so how do we start thinking about some of those different sort of scenarios and how they might emerge in the future and what we need to do? I think that's all the questions that have kind of come through for this morning. So thank you very much, Benji, for your time and your input. I think there are some common themes from that discussion that we've had about those differential impacts around how it's been driven by changes within different industrial structures in each region and how that's playing out for different communities, and that we're also only just at the start of this process. So as those changes kind of continue to emerge and new bits of data will hopefully become available, we'll start to get more insight to what we need to do as economic development professionals. I think the other message that I took from the 3 sessions we've had this morning is just how important the role of economic developers are in responding to this, and the needs to think about that as we move into the next sort of sessions over the next couple of days when we start looking at some of those responses. So it's been a really good couple of presentations this morning. People will see from the agenda that we have a natural break now, so there's an opportunity to get your delayed morning tea or a early lunch. And our next speaker, Dr. Ganesh Nana, who from Burl, who's always kind of interesting and challenging in these conversations. So we'll be sort of stopping the webinar now, and we'll be coming back online for that next session at 1:30 when we'll hear from Dr. Ganesh Nana, and then also a further session after that from Tony. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of hours' time. As advertised, we're due back for this afternoon's session. Welcome to all of you who have joined us, and welcome back to those that were here this morning. My name is Patrick McVeigh. For those that you don't know me, I'm the virtual MC this year. Just a couple of points that I'll repeat that I made this morning in terms of protocols. If you can mute yourself and turn off your cameras, and then if you have some questions, please use the chat function. Each of the speakers is trying to save some time at the end of their sessions to take questions. I'll try and keep an eye on the questions as they come through in chat to put back to the speakers at the end. It was a really good conversation this morning. I hope those of you that were here enjoyed it. We've got another two great speakers this afternoon. The first speaker, Dr. Ganesh Nana, who most of you will know. He's the research director from Burl. Ganesh is a regular contributor to EDNZ conferences and discussions. We really appreciate his support and his insights, which I'm sure he will share with us today. The theme, as we know today, is all about the economic impact, and I think Ganesh has got some interesting things to share upon us, looking at past impacts of previous events such as COVID. I'm going to hand over to Ganesh now, and again I'll mute myself as well. And Ganesh, when I turn my camera back on, it's because we're getting ready for questions, etc. But we've got a little bit of time because we know that your insights at these types of conferences always get the discussion going. So welcome, and over to you, Ganesh.
Thank you, Patrick. Kia ora tātou. Hopefully things are reasonably okay in all your parts of the world, wherever you might be zooming in from. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's all a bit different now, and I think I'm not quite sure we've quite got used to this new way of doing things, but to be honest, looks like we might have to get used to this for a little bit longer. I'll just share my screen, which hopefully will function in as much as I can work this place. And yes, just introduce my topic for today. I was asked to talk about some comparisons or some maybe lessons that we've learned from previous shocks to the system, and I suppose just sending a bit of a signal through to everybody that that economy, however we might define it, has actually been through numerous shocks over the past, not just in New Zealand but globally, and through various means we've managed to navigate our way through those shocks. Obviously the damage done in some of those shocks has been quite harsh. And I suppose the most important thing, or the most difficult thing, is those shocks, or the damage done by those shocks, tends not to be evenly distributed across either an economy or a people or regions, and so there are always those who get hurt a lot more than others. And I think that's the challenge in front of us, to figure out a way to not only navigate our way through this particular shock, but also ensure that the hurt that is undoubtedly something we have to endure is, I suppose, spread in a way that doesn't hurt the most vulnerable the most. So I suppose the subtext of this is that whatever shocks hit the economy, it is actually no news or no different, in the sense that we've always had a government that will come, I won't say to the rescue, but that will always come to respond, and it's always expected to respond somehow. So despite or some of our teachings about how the market has always been the best influence on all of us in terms of delivering prosperity, in the background, and I suppose sometimes in the foreground, there has actually been the role of government in navigating us through these shocks. I think the first thing, though, is to put on record is this thing called the economy, and it is a point of some considerable concern to myself in particular, is that we have in some cases a very narrow version of the economy, and the worry that we have whether we're in economic development or whether we're in business or whether we're community leaders or local government. We have this knee-jerk response. Some of us have this knee-jerk response in terms of an approaching shock that we know is coming, and our immediate response is to talk about that economy and how much it's going to get hurt, when not many are actually talking about the economy in general. Most are talking about dollars and cents and their own financial situation. And I think we have to be careful about talking about the economy in only dollars and cents, because that ignores what really is the economy, because it is about people and it is about resources that we have available to us. And I think, and that's where I worry about this idea that the market will always save the economy. The market is always focused on the financials, unfortunately, and it always tends to be focused on the short term. It is the government's job, for want of a better reason, because there's no one else out there at the moment looking after the other parts of the economy that are just as important. And I have a different perspective on trying to, I suppose, redefine the economy in words that are a little bit more, I suppose, open to interpretation, but also a little bit more welcoming to those who may feel, what's the word, threatened by dollars and cents and threatened by everything that's turned into financial measures, and indeed get turned off when someone talks about we've got to save the economy, when they always interpret that as saving dollars and cents. Well, I much prefer that we save the economy in the context of our role as guardians of the resources that we have been given by our tupuna, and that we have been trusted with to not only look after, but to make sure that we can pass on to our next generation. And that's very much how I interpret the economy. And yes, there are shocks along the way, but we have, and previous generations in particular, have been moderately successful in making sure that the economy survives the many shocks that have hit it, not just in New Zealand, but globally. And we have all managed over past generations to leave to the next generation a set of resources or a set of treasures that are indeed a little bit better than what we inherited in the first place. And I think critical, without putting too much, or without overstating it too much, I think it's fair to say, well, I believe it's fair to say that without government, the track record for the market mechanism will be pretty grim indeed. And there's a list of, I suppose, global type shocks or crises that we've had over the last, probably about the last 150 years or so. And the 1870s stands out as a, it's only because I've just started it there, but that stands out as the different one, in the sense that there wasn't actually a role for government way back then. In the 1870s, there wasn't an accepted role for government. And indeed, that depression was very lengthy and long, in the sense of leaving many not only without jobs, but literally fighting for their own survival. Since then, though, we've had a sequence of somewhat regular crises or shocks to hit the economy and or society and community. They all go together. Inevitably, there's been a combination of government or other national bodies or super international bodies or organisations that have, for want of a better, come to the rescue, or at least devised some sort of policy responses to navigate our way through the economy, or navigate our way through the shock, to, I suppose, save the economy in that broadest sense of the word. But it's not just all, I suppose, from a negative perspective in terms of government coming in after the shock. Government also has been, I would argue, quite positive in its impact on some of the good things that have happened over past generations, and a relatively small list down the bottom that all required, to some degree or another, in some instances, quite a large degree of government intervention or government role. Some are quite peripheral, but helping us not only save the economy, but improve it in the sense of improving the resources and treasures that we have to leave to the next generation. So in that context, I think it's important that we think about and talk about how government has responded or what options there are. And it may be a little bit academic, but what options there are in terms of government responding to shocks and crises, and are there things that we can learn from in terms of past responses. And I think the first thing that we need to learn from is this idea that economists on their own or the market on their own is going to solve the issue or solve the shock or navigate us our way through the shock. And as you can see, this quote from before the 1930 era was very much capturing the flavour of the time when economists were very much focused on the market mechanism leading us towards an equilibrium. We didn't worry too much about how we got there, but we knew it was going to get there, and all we had to do was wait till we got there, and then everything was okay. And that's been paraphrased by a very famous economist in the quote up on the slide in front of you. And I think that's part of the challenge in front of us. Markets and businesses tend to say, yeah, just focus on the long run and then we can get there. And even sometimes governments and definitely economists, it is the long run that matters. But actually, most of our time is spent in the short run, spent in responding to these crises that we have, or shocks, whether we call them crises or not, depends on, I suppose, how bad they are. Just a very quick, I suppose, look back through New Zealand's history in terms of I just picked out some of the shocks that we've, or phases of activity that we've been through. And this is by no means all of them. But as I say, the 1930s was the sea change in terms of a role of government. And in the New Zealand context, we had the establishment of the Reserve Bank, and that enabled us to control our own currency, and effectively gave the government a tool or an instrument that it could use when faced with a shock. And of course, the 1930s depression, not only did we have the government coming in with monetary control, we had the government coming in with providing a safety net to, I suppose, ease the harm on some sections of the population. But also, quite importantly, we had active intervention. Actually, government came in to spend dollars on, at the time, public works and housing, as well as in industrial and manufacturing policy. And I think that was the very start of a realisation that government had a role in the economy in terms of responding to the shocks that hit us. In the intervening period, there was a big role for government, obviously, in terms of the Second World War. And I find it curious that whenever there is a war, no one ever queries the role of government in managing not just the economy, well, literally managing the economy in the context of providing supplies and ammunitions and those sorts of things, and a workforce, directing them to where they need to go. But after the war, still a strong level of government involvement. I suppose the 1958 period, when there was a very strong, I suppose, challenge to our ability to earn dollars abroad, and that was responded to by government with an increase in taxes, which would then stop us spending, and in particular stop New Zealanders spending on imports, which was very much an important part back then in the structure of the New Zealand economy. And again in 1967, similar problems in terms of trying to access foreign currency. Those were the times when foreign currency was not easily tradable across borders. It was all very controlled. We could only access foreign currency if we exported enough things, and if we didn't export enough things, we had to do something at home. And in 1967, the currency got devalued by, I think it was a good 20-odd%. through the 1970s. I've got a picture to show through some of that period. Most of the adjustment to shocks was done through the foreign currency, or basically through changes in the exchange rate, and in particular through the 1970s. For those who may not be aware, if you're not old enough to remember, that was a decade very much hit by a whole lot of oil price shocks. There were two in particular, once when the oil price, and I'll have to remember, but literally I think tripled overnight in the 73 oil shock, and then similarly again in 1977, doubled again in price. And in those days, New Zealand had to, well, as we do already still now, import almost all of our oil. And the response to those shocks was a devaluation, ongoing devaluation of the New Zealand dollar and or import controls. We couldn't import, even if you wanted to, you would not get the license to import the things you wanted. Thereafter, 1980s, when the world all changed, the currency became floated, we didn't have import controls, and we had to have a new way, or the government needed a new way of responding to shocks. Throughout that whole period, though, it's just I suppose, to reinsure all New Zealanders, and even those in yourselves in the local government space or in economic development, that the role of government isn't actually new. Government has always stepped in, at least over the last 100 years, in response to shocks. It's never been the business sector on its own. It's never been the private markets on its own. There has always been a role for government, and that role has changed over time, but has changed only in nature, but remains there as an accepted response to the shocks. Many of those shocks we have, of course, are from shocks from abroad, we have very little control over. In terms of the cycles, and I like this unemployment rate because it gives us a bit of a sense of where we're at in terms of this shock that we've got in New Zealand at the moment. The unemployment rate up until about the mid-1970s were pretty close to negligible for various reasons, but primarily because the government chose a different mechanism to manage the economy, and that was the period of essentially fixed exchange rates, stringent controls on imports. So while you were in a job, I suppose as the story some goes, as my father would say, while you're in a job and your job was pretty secure, you couldn't really spend it on much because we didn't import very much at all. And now I suppose that's taking it a bit to extremes, but I suppose that's the type of economy that was there. Through the 80s, unemployment climbed up towards that 4% level, and that partly was response to the or a hangover of the oil price shocks and other stuff that happened over that period. And then into the 1990s, you'll see the peak that it has been historically, at least over the period we think of, at 11% in the early 1990s as a result of some cumulative shocks, definitely after the 87 shock and definitely after some issues with the government budget in the early 1990s. Just for a context, on an unemployment measure, that 11% is definitely the peak over our, I suppose, not quite living memory, but definitely over the last 50 to 60 years. The Great Depression of the 1930s, we obviously haven't got the greatest sets of data back then, but most estimates would place the unemployment rate in that period at about 30 odd or 30+%, and it's of that order of magnitude of about a third of the workforce out of work, and that's not just in New Zealand but across most other economies across the globe. That just gives us context that since then we have managed to at least manage or successfully manage the unemployment indicator reasonably a lot better than the Great Depression, but obviously there has been some highs and lows throughout it. You will see that the latest, or the GFC crisis and the earthquakes in about 2009, 10, 11 period did see the latest, I suppose, spike in unemployment up towards that 6% level. and it's spent a good decade since then, or maybe not, about 8 years since then, bringing it down to about that 4% mark. So that's I suppose, a sense of the economic crisis that we've got in front of us in terms of people out of jobs. The problem being that 2020 figure of 4% is a bit of a statistical glitch, because we know it's higher than that at the moment, because we know, and I think I might have shown this chart to some others on a previous ED seminar before, but updated to about a month ago, we know there has been roughly about 70,000 more people on job seeker support since the beginning of March. So over the last 5 to 6 months, we have seen an increase in people on job seeker support, plus that new benefit called the CIRP, which is effectively a higher level payment for people that have lost their jobs through COVID-19. But that's still another 70,000 on the jobless figure. And I suppose these mix of data, but just looking at unemployment benefit recipients rather than the official unemployment rate, back over the last 40 odd years or so, we haven't had 200,000 people on the equivalent of job seeker support ever in the past, except for the period in the early 1990s, and then again just in the late 1990s, early 2000s. The biggest thing that's scary of this particular thing is the rapidity of the spike right on the very right hand side of this graph, just how quickly it has gone, literally in a few months, from a relatively low figure to a relatively high figure. If we include this information on into the previous chart, it would suggest our true unemployment rate in New Zealand is now somewhere between the 6 and a 6.5% rate. So we're already at about the rate of joblessness that we had as a result of the GFC and the earthquakes. And there's an argument about, there's a discussion, I suppose, about whether it will get much worse. I think we're waiting on, I suppose, the lifting of the wage subsidy, which will undoubtedly make these numbers worse, or a bit of a question mark about how government will respond post-election, when it has the ability to respond in terms of either revamping the wage subsidy or putting in different support mechanisms. Just in terms of these spikes or shocks, I think it's interesting just to go through a couple of the scenario responses, a couple of the government policy responses that we could have. And you'll see in this picture, which is the New Zealand dollar exchange rate since 1980, you'll see in the early half, or in the early portion of this graph, we have effectively a depreciation or devaluation in the New Zealand dollar. So that's a downward slide in that graph, and that's effectively what is the response to shocks back then. Either they were the oil crisis or the hangover from the oil price shock, or ongoing difficulties with import controls and ability to export, and we saw a decline in the exchange rate throughout. Since then, since about 1990, that exchange rate has fluctuated up and down with no real pattern or no real link to either joblessness or any sense of shocks or economic cycles. Effectively, what you've got now is the exchange rate is no longer an option as a government policy response, because it's effectively set by forces external to us, set by the currency markets abroad, and New Zealand has little ability to influence that, given all those other external influences. So we have to look at other options in terms of a response. So we park the exchange rate response, and up until recently we relied on, and it's not really government, but it's independent of government, but it really is government, the Reserve Bank to respond using monetary policy as a response to the shocks that maybe we're facing. And it does this primarily through the official cash rate, or the interest rate that it charges other banks. And you'll see, I suppose, in terms of the shocks through the period between about 2003 up to about 2009, when we had declines in unemployment and inflationary pressures, which were causing economic strife, when the monetary policy response was to stop us trying to spend, so therefore increasing the OCR from about 4% to 8%. That was the response. Come the GFC, there was a very immediate and dramatic response on the OCR from a peak of just over 8%, crunching it down very quickly with a couple of emergency cuts in the OCR down to 2.5%. And it's been relatively low throughout. The problem with a relatively low official cash rate throughout is then come another shock. There's not much left that monetary policy can do. And as we know, as the chart shows towards the end of this, towards the period now, while the cash rate has come down to 0.25%, there's little left in the holster in terms of monetary policy from the cash rate scenario. So we have to devise new policy, the new monetary policy response. So governments are pretty, well, I won't say clever, but there are things that we can do and have done in the past. In the New Zealand context now, we've got what's called quantitative easing, which is a technical term for the Reserve Bank printing money to enable the government to spend. Since the 25th of March this year, as shown by the blue line, the Reserve Bank has effectively printed about $22 billion already. It's got another 78 billion ready to go up until mid-2022. So there's no shortage of monetary policy responses available. The Reserve Bank has also suggested possible negative interest rates, and there'll be negative interest rates at the wholesale level, not for you and me, but for banks lending amongst themselves, and also direct lending from the Reserve Bank to other banks to get more lending out to businesses and to communities. So the government response hasn't finished, but monetary policy is struggling. And so we now go back to the other arm of government, which is fiscal policy, which is government taxes and spending. In the olden days, this was very much the primary response. Since we've had an interregnum where monetary policy has been the primary response, since monetary policy is, I suppose, run out of ammunition, fiscal policy has come back into vogue. Just comparing the responses to the shocks, the latest shock, or the two shocks, if we put the GFC and the earthquake shocks together in the New Zealand context and compare that to the response to COVID-19 by government, what you have on the left-hand side, you had a GFC earthquake government response of the order of about 35% of GDP spread over about 4 years. Most of it, oh, not most of it, I say fairly well balanced between a blue and the red, fairly well balanced between spending increase and reducing taxes as a response to the GFC and the earthquakes. The right-hand bar is the response to COVID-19 as currently projected by government, which is surprisingly not that much more than the GFC, which is, and I think that's a signal that there's going to be a lot bigger either post-election or into next year's budget, but not much more compared to the GFC, comparing the size of the responses and the size of the shocks. But the interesting difference undoubtedly is that this time round, the government has chosen the fiscal response to be primarily through spending rather than through any reduction in taxes. And I suppose in the tax side of the world, just going through a little bit more detail. Tax revenue as a proportion of GDP is actually quite low in the New Zealand context. Definitely if you compare it to 2008, before the GFC, it was at about 30%. The GFC, we had a tax cut, and that's brought that ratio down. And it really hasn't, from a government perspective, that tax revenue element really hasn't recovered that much. So there's, I suppose, if the government wished to, it could increase taxes if it wanted to, if there was a reason for it to do so, and not be, I suppose, outside the bounds of recent history. On the spending side of things, we are, because this government has chosen very much the spending side, this government has responded quite dramatically in the context of a spending response to this crisis or shock. What you get out of this picture, though, is, according to the Treasury forecast anyway, they're expecting a very short-term response and suggesting the spending response is relatively temporary and will be come back down in 3 or 4 years' time. Again, that's a question mark, and I would probably question quite strongly that last slide in spending, and indeed the previous slide in taxes into the future. But I suppose my message is that there's still a fair bit of elbow room for both government and or monetary policy to respond to the shocks that we've got in front of us. Whether we like it or not, it's going to have to. Private businesses are, at the moment, and even if we do have a rapid, well, it's unlikely we have a rapid vaccine and a rapid opening of the borders, so private businesses unlikely to be beyond much past short-term cash flow. Households, especially facing unemployment, has no appetite for spending, despite some of the spending data that's out there, which is purely a, I suppose, purely a response to us having been locked up for a few weeks, and we'll go out and spend, but that's short-term rather than long-term. Government must step up. Exchange rate's definitely an option, not an option anymore. Monetary policy, not really that much of an option other than just printing money, but the Reserve Bank can print as much money as it likes. It really is a question of what that money is used for, and that's where local government and central government need to step in to take that money, make sure it doesn't get sitting on either businesses or banks' balance sheets, but is actually out there spending on people and infrastructure and things, services and those sorts of things. Whether we like it or not, and I think this is a bit of an overstatement, but it's curious that we've got a sort of a 40-year allergy to government, and this idea that government must be constrained and get out of the way, where we've actually had the best part of 100 years of record of government always stepping in when needed to respond to a variety of shocks. Yes, they've responded differently in different ways, obviously depending on the politics of the day, and indeed depending on the instruments that are available at the time. But without doubt, government has always stepped in, whether it be fiscal or monetary or exchange rate policy. And this time will be no exception. And I suppose the critical thing is how is this government intervention going to be different than before? We've got a signal that's going to be spending. I know many people are worried about the spending and how it is financed, and obviously with the Reserve Bank printing money, that's one element of financing it. But again, there's a question of the consequences of that, in the sense of who benefits from that printing of the money, or who benefits from the spending. I think we're moving into a world where we've got to get away from this idea that it's always to do with productivity and it's always to do with efficiency. because we've been down that road for the last, I suppose, 30 to 40 years, which has been a narrative to keep government out of the way and let businesses focus on productivity and efficiency. That actually hasn't delivered. I'll be open about that. I don't think it hasn't delivered, and I can give you some evidence if you like on that. But I think more importantly is how do we move forward into a much more sophisticated version of efficiency and productivity. It's not the one-way direction of causality. How profitable you are and how much you actually pay your people actually has an influence on how productive you are. It's a lot more convoluted and complex situation. I think the lesson of the last 30 to 40 years, or indeed the lesson of the last 70 years, is faced with so many shocks and so many challenges, so many crises, reliant on government to a degree to I won't say bail us out, but to respond accordingly at the time. Maybe it's time for us, whether we're in government or in business, to focus a little bit more on our ability to cope with these shocks, more and more on our ability to be resilient in the face of these shocks, because these shocks are not going to stop. Indeed, depending upon how miserable I am, I think they're going to be even more prevalent in the future. And we haven't even started talking about climate change yet, and haven't even started talking about inequality and those sorts of things. So the shocks have always been here in the past. They will also continue. We've fooled ourselves into pretending that efficiency will get us past these shocks. As long as we're productive and profitable, we'll get past those shocks. Well, we can be productive as we like, but if we aren't resilient, if we continue to focus on the short-term productivity means least cost inputs, we don't get a resilient production sector, we don't get a resilient community, we don't get resilient value chains. What we get is very efficient ones, but they fall apart at the start of any shock. So the conversation needs to be about resilience rather than efficiency. And that's the context that I put when we talk about whether we can afford to spend on infrastructure or whether we can afford to ignore the infrastructure and just make sure we pay off our debt. I'll leave that with you. I know there'll probably be lots of questions, but I think it's probably a good idea to leave it there and open it up for some questions.
Thanks very much, Ganesh. Lots of important information in there as usual. There's a couple of questions that have come through that I'll link together, and I'll ask you two particular things. So the first one, two parts. So are you still anticipating that we'll see double-digit unemployment? And in the context of that, given that we've already crossed that sort of threshold in terms of numbers of jobs lost compared to the GFC, particularly in places like Auckland, what might be the overall impact of that on our economic prosperity, both as a region, but also nationally, given the size of Auckland? And in particular, some of those intergenerational unemployment issues that perhaps aren't as obvious when you look at the numbers, but we know the long kind of tail, the long impact of this on communities. And I know you're very passionate about the equity issues and you've only touched upon them. So maybe a few words on your sort of thoughts about the scale of this and how we need to think about it.
Yeah, that's challenging questions, but I won't skirt around them. If we keep unemployment at below the double digits, I think we've done pretty well out of this. And that's obviously no good to those who are actually jobless. But I think reality, given what we're already at about 6.5%, we're already at the GFC peak. I think that's the target or the challenge. No one is suggesting we're getting anywhere near the Great Depression. So I won't say we're comfortable. We think in our structures and the policies that we have an ability to manage that jobless number. I suppose the mid-case bill scenario is around that 10% peak, but what we have is a much longer horizon and that's where the problems lie. We might be reasonably successful in keeping the numbers down to I suppose, a manageable level, maybe 8-9%, but it's going to be here for a lot longer than definitely what some of the optimistic Treasury forecasts are looking at. And I think that's the challenge, and that's where the equity argument is. And I think that's where my resilience argument is. When you're talking about communities, you're talking about literally intergenerational unemployment. That's when the resilience falls apart. Communities and families can't be resilient if they haven't had that experience of being in a job to pass that experience on. And I think that's where regions like Auckland, regions like most other regions around the country, I think Wellington's going to be the only one that's reasonably, I won't say immune to it, but given the presence of government here and our ability to work from home a lot more than other parts of the country. But Auckland, yeah, the challenge is around that last slide I had around the appetite to spend on infrastructure. And that's both local and central government. And my worry is that both local and central government get blindsided by the debt target or the debt ceiling that somebody else has imposed on them. Hopefully we'll be a lot cleverer about it and actually, I won't say just spend, but spend on stuff that's actually useful. And whether that's on community infrastructure, whether that's on skills training, whether that's on apprenticeship program, all those sorts of things that have already been announced. Some of them already been announced, your green employment projects, those sorts of things. But I just hope we ramp them up a lot quicker and faster to get past that equity argument. But also, I think now's the time to do that infrastructure for the future. And I mentioned climate change in passing, but there's a whole lot of stuff that we really have to do. And indeed in Auckland, if you're talking about water, you can talk about water in any part of the country. The government's, it's about $800 million for water announced to whatever it was last month. And that's not even going to touch the sides in terms of water infrastructure that we have to do. That's a lot, most of that is basically catching up on lost maintenance. So there's no shortage of stuff to do. There's no shortage of jobs to be done. And in my opinion, there's no shortage of funders to do it, i.e. that's government. It's a question of our appetite for that.
And you've partly answered the next question, but I want to sort of bring it out a bit more. So some people have asked this sort of notion about, is increasing productivity not part of building resilience? But beyond that, what are the things that you would recommend that we should all be focusing on in order to build resilience in our local communities?
Yeah, well, as I said in the slide, as I hopefully displayed in the slide, productivity and resilience are not one on their own. They're not separate. They are together. I think my point is that for too long we've focused on productivity alone and not talked about resilience. And so productivity on its own, unfortunately, leads us down the race to the bottom, the race to the least cost. When you're putting out a project for tender, you immediately go to the least cost. Well, not immediately, I'm exaggerating, but you tend to go to the least cost and believe that's most efficient, believe that's most productive. And hopefully in New Zealand, we've learned that that's not the best way of doing things, because we've had a whole lot of examples where that definitely wasn't. And so resilience together with productivity is going beyond the costs. Look at the four well-beings of whatever project you're looking at. Look honestly at the four well-beings. Don't just look at the financials. And I've said it so many times, four well-beings are not the nice to haves. They are integral to any sense of community infrastructure or building resilience in a community. And I think that's where local government can make the biggest contribution, is to take those four well-beings seriously. Okay, we can't measure some of them in a quantitative sense, but we do know when faced with alternative projects, we should be able to see or say which of them are going to make well-beings worse or better, or much worse or much better. I mean, we have that sense, and I think that's the sense of analysis and decision-making we're going to have to move into.
Yeah, that's great. And then one final theme that pulls across from some of the questions. So, and again, you've touched upon this, but if central government were to provide more resources to local government and to EDAs in part of this response, how would you think about how our role might need to change? So the role of the economic development profession, there's some immediate things that you're suggesting need to be done by local government. But if you looked out over time, what are the 2 or 3 things you would say we need to change as practitioners in order to address some of the concerns you're raising?
Well, I think the broadening of the horizon about what is economics, what is that economy. And I may be exaggerating, but I know many EDAs still have the whakapapa of being a tourism organisation. And that has driven some of them into that very, I suppose, narrow focus about visitor numbers and indeed about spending. As long as we can spend more dollars, that somehow translates into economic development. We've got to be much broader thinking. Let's take on board the 4 well-beings and let's not focus on, I suppose, spending indicators. Let's focus on indicators of resilience, indicators of well-being. Whether they be, and this is, I suppose, that argument, and I know some people push back, or we shouldn't be measuring stuff we can't influence. But I'm not suggesting they're your KPIs, but let's start measuring things like homelessness or things like poverty in your areas or access to education. Yes, they're not in your ballpark, you won't be able to influence them, but that they are part of that economic mechanism that you need to be aware of. And indeed, you may not be able to improve them, but you know some of your projects may actually make some of those things worse. And so you need to be aware of that at the very least. So it's, without being too challenging, it's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, definitely. Ganesh, thank you very much for your time and for your ongoing support and input to EDNZ. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully in person next year.
Thank you. Look forward to it. All
Great.
the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Ganesh. One of the things I've realised as a facilitator in these environments is we can't call for a round of applause. So take it that you've had one. Okay, last session of today's programme. And we're joined by Tony Henderson Newport from the Pop-Up Business School. Great to see you again, Tony. We've had a lot of input this morning. Some of our sort of leading economists thinking about, how this impact is being felt across the country, felt in different industries, felt in different regions. And a couple of people have talked about that importance of, keeping our small businesses going and kind of thinking about that aspect in terms of new businesses being created off the response of kind of COVID and industrial restructuring. So it's a great opportunity to end the session today to hear more about some of the work that you've been involved in and that kind of long-term impact of small business growth and development. So Tony, I'll hand it over to you now, and we look forward to hearing your presentation, and we'll pull together some questions. When I come back on, it's because I'm giving you the sort of 5-minute countdown to finish up.
That sounds awesome. You can hear me all right, Patrick?
Yep, great.
Thank you. Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka. Ka tangi hoki a hau. Ko Tony Henderson Newport toku ingawa no whanganui atara a hau. Ko Pop-Up Business School toku ko papa mahi. No reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Listen, thanks everyone. I'm really grateful for this chance to share a little bit of the journey. It feels almost like, as Patrick said, we're coming from a attendee perspective, an entrepreneur perspective, to balance out against what's been an amazing set of presentations today. So I just quickly want to cover a little bit about the business context, the story so far. And I think it's important because we do a longitudinal study, but without the context of that study, it doesn't necessarily make the same amount of sense. So we drew some data from the Small Business Council and some of the information that they provide. And a lot of these facts I won't go into because you already know them. This is your market. This is how you function. And the world that I function in is very much related to small business. And it's not just the small business that gets off the ground, it's the small business that's already off the ground. And so part of that logic is all about how do you help someone to stay up. The Pop-Up Business School is, for those who don't know, it's a free to attend 10-day series of workshops. We usually do 20 workshops, a trade show, a celebration event. We're now online and in venue. And we have also, as a result of COVID, we've had to pivot. And we've found that some degree of support for our blended course, which we're running in the Hutt Valley at the moment, and that has 50 to 60 day-on-day small business owners, some of which have already been in business, some of which are in business, and some of which are wanting to get off the ground. And I'll cover a little bit about those statistics. We have an absolute focus on some aspects, which are how do you start a business with no money is a really good example of some of the things that are important in the world that we function. Activating sales and marketing, compliance, building websites, and everything that we do is like, don't go into business with debt, which has become suddenly more and more important, especially if you see the world as at the moment, how social media feeds into marketing and how to make money doing what you love. And that sounds very simplistic, I know, but there's needless to say a lot more to that engine than is there at the moment. So for those, again, who don't know, the Pop-Up Business School is a startup itself. It's now only 3.5 years old, and that all came about from diving down a rabbit hole called Facebook, and realizing that in the UK, 2011, 2012, they formed Pop-Up Business School, and I felt that it addressed a niche that was important in New Zealand. And those are the people who don't often get a chance to start a business. They're not necessarily graduates, they may be unemployed, and how do we support those people to come to a Pop-Up Business School and for that to be free. We have a set of values that we have, and from day one we wanted to deeply entrench ourselves within our own culture, and how do we bring that to life, and we're most probably on a 10-year journey around biculturalism and how do we embrace all of our migrant cultures that are in New Zealand at the moment. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think that if we are encouraging inclusivity, integrity, kindness, respect and faith in our business and our ideas, and for those who have faith, that we're also acknowledging that, then we have a bit of a start. And the other thing that we've done is from the get-go, we were looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and how could we, in our small way in the Pop-Up Business School, work towards those areas of sustainability that are more about the Sustainable Development Goals. What is it that we can do to support a business to be successful, to address no poverty, which in turn will address zero hunger and gender equality, economic growth, obviously important in the world that we function, reduce inequalities, and through all of that to build sustainable communities. Because we believe that they are connected. We've grown from me banging on doors saying, I think this is a good idea, to a small team. What I can say is that we have an ethos that all of our team should also own their own business, so that if they're ever asked a question by one of the other startup business owners, then they are talking peer-to-peer. And that our team understand the pain of being in business, about finding sales, about developing a niche, and about staying in business. And so that one of the early decisions that we made that I'm really proud of is to know that our existing team all have their own businesses and we're all talking from the same hymn sheet. There's whether those are coming up as black blocks on the screen or not. Our raison d'etre, our reason for being in business, is really about enabling small business startups, but also building confidence and capability. And I guess there's something that everyone that's at this conference has a focus on, which is point 3. It's how do we support businesses to stay in business for one more year, and then one more year, and then repeat. Because the longer that they stay in business, the more chances there are to grow that business, to employ staff, to feed the economy in a different way. And so one of the things that we did from the get-go was we created and we curate our own business ecosystem to complement support the different ecosystems that we bump into as we go around the country. And that's an alumni program. And the idea of that program is to support the business ecosystems. It aims to provide continued collaborative support. And so on the screen on this presentation, you will start to see some of the things that we've done to provide unique opportunities for our alumni. So we, at the moment, are closing on 800 graduates. In our closed support group, we have 700 odd members. And then separately, we have things where we have business tools and processes, marketing concepts, our webinars, doing alumni spotlights, which we can promote across our ecosystem, externally and internally. And the whole point of that exercise is to give confidence to the attendee that they're not alone. And we introduced a couple of other things. We released an app, BizEasy, globally about, goodness me, getting close to a year now. We're still in infancy on that, but that's a tool which is designed to cross from the business model canvas over to the business plan. In other words, we gamified the front end of the business plan so that the business owner can understand their business model and at a certain point press a button and it will migrate the data to build their business plan. Not perfectly, but enough so that they have a better understanding of their business model rather than just writing the plan. We have weekly webinars for our alumni, and we've just recently introduced Masterclass where a colleague of ours in the United States who works for a pre-accelerate over there, Armagan Saeed, will ring in. Our next session is actually all about competitive analysis. And the point about all of that is that if you've got an ecosystem already, and I know that they exist all across New Zealand, how do we bring that ecosystem to the entrepreneurs as opposed to trying to get the entrepreneur to plug into different parts of that ecosystem? So the people that come, so this is really interesting, I think. 72% of our attendees are women. We have a good age spread, but we know that we can do more in the younger and older demographics. We have normally, as an average guide, 25% to 26% of our attendees are Maori, and then Pakeha, European and other. We have an increasing number of Asian participants and also migrants. In the employment stats, self-employed. So this is where people will often think, oh, somebody's coming to the pop-up business school because they want to start a business. 29% of our attendees are already self-employed, but they have gaps that they want to plug. And obviously, those are things that we would love the business ecosystem that exists in their locale to be able to help them with as well. Employed, 21%, but look at that, 33% unemployed. When I was first done, Patrick might remember this from a long time ago when I was trying to get this off the ground in Aotearoa. But something that people said to us, well, people come for free, they're not going to value it. And yet it's the people who come for free because they can't go somewhere else is the niche that we function in. And having close to 800 attendees and graduates of the school now tells us that there's actually a bulk of people out there who don't feel that they can afford to do things, and yet they can. And so that's something that I think the community can deal with. So what's happened is that we've run 18 events, 16 trade shows, 362 workshops. Now the big blue and green bubbles are the ones that are of real interest. So 370 businesses were in process. And our longitudinal study starts to tap into that. And then 150 businesses started during the 10 days of the course. And I think that's the part that we want to focus on as well. It has actually never been easier to start a business. Validating it and keeping it up, but that's the two different things. The research around, yes, this is a good idea. And if you do start it, how do you get to stay up for one more year? And this particular slide is really all about, this is only taken from 3 out of, we're currently running our 19th event. So this is taken out of 3 events. And this is an ecosystem. So besides some repeats that you might see, business.gov.nz and the New Zealand business number. There's also Chambers of Commerce, there's Xero, there's Business Mentors New Zealand, there's Work and Income, Ministry of Social Development, websites. There's a raft of things that go on in the local business ecosystem. And we believe that part of our job is to connect individuals into that local business ecosystem. I think one of the things that we were really enthused by was when we did Wanganui One, which was our second ever event in New Zealand. That was entirely funded by Te Manawatatu, which was the Maori business network in Wanganui. And the thing that interested me about that is the commitment that they had to all of Wanganui and its surrounding regions to build businesses and to make Wanganui stronger and to be part of the journey for each individual business owner. And so we've had touch points into the Ministry of Pacific Peoples, into Te Puna Kōkiri, and one of our big sponsors, besides the likes of ATED in Auckland and Wellington NZ, who put funding into any events that we run in those two regions, has been the Ministry of Social Development. And they trialled us in Tairāwhiti, Gisborne, goodness me, must be 18 months ago. But without the support of all of those regional councils and economic development agencies, we wouldn't have been able to support in our own way all of those businesses that are looking to build their businesses in those different regions around the country. So this is taken from our all event impact, capability impact. Now, the point I guess I want to make here is that you'll recall that in a previous slide, we had 150 businesses that started from the event and a number that were in process. The thing about the business owner is it should be the stuff that we can put around the business owner. In other words, what is it that we can do to build the business owner's confidence and capability? Because the stronger and more resilient that individual or partnership or company is, the likelihood they're going to be able to bring that resilience into the local economy. And the ripple effect from that is quite significant. The ripple effect will impact their whānau, it will impact the community, and all of those different aspects of building a business in a region. All because, so we absolutely take a holistic approach. So we measure happiness and confidence before and after the course. What's their levels of motivation? And generally, when somebody comes on the pop-up business school, they're pretty motivated because they've got a business idea, they want to do something about it. And their business skills, how can we improve their belief that actually taxes and the inland revenue is not a big bad wolf, but actually their friend. And there's so many things around bookkeepers and accountants and professionals that can surround a business that actually we want them to embrace as part of that ecosystem. And self-efficacy is actually the belief in your own capability that you can do this thing. You can actually create this business, that you can be successful. And so working with those individuals to enable that, that's the part that we really love and we really enjoy, because what we see is we see those motivated, confident, more confident individuals. And what we notice over the 10 days is this transformational effect. And Matt Correa, who is a business development in ATED, talks about it at every event. And Jonathan Sudworth, who I think is on the call as well, he sees the same thing in ATED in Auckland. At the very beginning of the course, people come in and they're uncertain, they're unsure. And over the 10 days, they become a cohort where they are there to support each other to be in business. And the amazing thing about that is that they are then able to support each other to grow. One of the things that we notice in our national support group or in our sub-support groups, what we notice is that somebody might spot a market which is being set up in a particular area and they tell everybody else about it. They spot that the regional development are doing something in their area and they tell everybody else about it in the cohort. And we love that that communication is really organic, but transformational from the point where they come into the course and when they leave. Part of our job is to maintain those levels of confidence and motivation, but also to support them if they need it. And that's why we run follow-up workshops, we run our webinars, we provide the tools and processes, because if we can do our small part, then just hopefully all of that benefit will come back to the regions. And if I think about that, what we we're a small business and we're only a few years old. So as we can afford to do things, we do things. So of our 19 events, we've been able to invest in an independent research house to go out and talk to 4 of our events. In the 4 events, of the 100% that came to those 4 events, we had a 52% participation rate in the survey. So we call an active attendee someone who comes for 3 days or more, and on average we would have a stick rate of around 7.8 to 8.1 days out of the 10 days that people come for. And we work really hard to make sure that people can come for the very most of the 10 days. And life does get in the way. We have family, if something goes wrong, the kids, you might get a call and suddenly you can't be there because the child's rung and the school's rung and said, the child's sick, come and get them. And so there's things that impact people's ability to grow their businesses, but to continue to be involved in a number of different things. What we found from that independent research was that over only 4 events, over 2 years, we returned $1.39 million back to the local economies. And so the question is, how did that happen? So what we found is that people were running businesses, the government benefits were reduced, there were less people unemployed, and therefore conversely, more people employed or self-employed. And so we can relate different rates to that to determine what that means in actual revenue to the country, bearing in mind that the country benefits, but actually what really benefits are the local regional economies. And so this is something that we will do more and more of as we can afford to do more and more of it because of that small business context that we function in. But the fact that we can do that we can help a business to be sustainable and see that impact in our local community makes us feel pretty chuffed, to be honest. And we don't know where the journey goes, but the whole point of the longitudinal study is to treat it exactly like the Dunedin study in Auckland, which has been going for 40 years. And so I don't know how long we'll be able to track those businesses, but that's the intention. What we notice is that not every business is still in business 1 or 2 years later, that some do fall by the wayside, but then what we do notice is some are employing more people. And you know the scale that's going to happen is almost a little bell curve of going up and then down. And what we're wanting to do is to encourage those businesses to stay in business so that they can generate more revenue and more income and more economic impact to the local economy. And the other thing that we found was that even after a period of time, irrespective of anything else, happiness was still on a good level. That confidence was good, that motivation was good, but importantly, business skills stayed up. And we really believe that if you can have skills that you've got that you didn't have 2 years before, and you can continue to deploy those skills, it actually lifts your confidence, your motivation, and your happiness. And so there's a level of detail and awareness in that we think does make a real difference. So I think, just checking the time, actually I think we're going pretty well. And so we might actually have some good time for questions as well. We did a business study and just recently, and what we were looking at was, well, what kind of business structures are there now? So I put up there, Maori businesses 25% actually responded in the survey. We had 20% response rate from our alumni, so just under 150, and we made that survey, put it out, and then got it back, and that was over 7 days. We were asking questions like, well, what's your business structure? And have you yet to decide what your structure might be? How long have you been in business? Is it only 1 year or is it 5 years? Because those are relevant pieces of data which help us to understand where we can plug support in, because we do want more and more of the attendees at the Pop-Up Business School to still be in business in 5 years. I guess it's also important to note that our alumni includes people who have decided not to be in business currently. And we don't say, oh, okay, not a business, therefore you're not part of our alumni, because that's not how the game works. As everybody on this call knows, sometimes it's the second or the third or the fourth attempt at business where all of the synergies come together and a success story is built. And we noticed that of that 20% response rate, that it was split in favour of services rather than products. And so while we have a really good, rich mix of industry sectors, it's not all crafts. We have consultants. We've got legal consultants. We've got business continuity consultants. We've got financial planning consultants. Besides the fact that we have tech and retail, there's a really nice, rich vein of businesses within that alumni program. And the interesting thing for me, if we talk about sectors, you can see here forestry and fishing, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, accommodation and food, transport. And that little list, as you can see from that graph, goes on. And oh, that was good of me, I managed to repeat that graph. But what you can also see is the impact from COVID-19. So the question that we asked was, COVID a major or a minor impact on your business? So 47% felt that it was a major impact. However, what's really interesting is that 27% said it was minor. We also counted the 10% that don't have a business, because that's, so therefore, but 16% who do have businesses said it had no impact. So we're in that stage of wanting to accumulate more data and understand why that impact. What is it that you did that did that? One of the questions that we asked was how many, did you then, as a result, pivot your account, your business? And actually, there have been a number that have pivoted their businesses, and we'll be able to make some of that data available post the conference as well, because I think it would be interesting for people to understand that out of these small businesses, many of whom are not university, most probably in the majority, are not university graduates from our experience. They come from families where the thought of being in business is a dream and a vision, and largely unattainable. We know in New Zealand that's not true. It has never been easier to start a business in New Zealand. However, staying up, that's the trick I think that all of us on this conference are looking to solve. Another couple of interesting tidbits of information from the survey was the change in levels of revenue. And so what we were seeing was that these are businesses that go from year one in the event to now. And some have been in business for 2 years or 3 years and some longer. But what we were finding is that at the very beginning of their journey, there were many that were making no sales. And some now are still making not a lot of sales. And then there's a bunch that actually don't have a business. So we want to make sure that they're visible. And then even now, you find that there's a bunch that are having sales under 10,000. But then it starts to change, and we would expect this as well, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, over 100, and over 250. Now, what's encouraging for us is that we would expect that over a period of time, sales will grow, that not every business will be able to necessarily get over $250,000 in sales, but some will. And then what is it, those lessons that we can learn? So one of the things that we do is we go back to those business owners that are making some inroads, and we ask those business owners to support the alumni in our webinars, and to be guest speakers, and to encourage the others about what they can do to get their business off the ground with no money or with no debt, and how can they grow those businesses, and when they do have to go into debt, how do they manage that, micromanage that, and understand their compliance needs, so that they're actually in a really congruent state with our government departments. And land revenue is a really good one, example of that. The other thing that was really interesting for us was the stage of business that people are at. And you can see here that I have changed direction, or pivoted since I started, and started a new business since the course. I launched my business during the course. I was already running my business before attending the course. soon to launch my business and not starting. The not starting thing is really quite interesting for us, because what we bank in are actually a number of micro-credentials. And I think this is a really interesting facet from encouraging people to start a business, that when you bank in micro-credentials, you become differently employable. And I love some of the stories that, I remember one story where a young lady who was about 17 came on the course, and she had a business idea, and that was tie-dye t-shirts. And so she did the course. She was interviewed about a year later, I think. And what came out of that was actually that she was employed. She never did start that business, but I was so much more confident when I went in for that interview. And I think that's the part sometimes in the economic development world, we forget that actually the skills and the knowledge that we impart to the people who come along to the Pop-Up Business School or into our own ecosystem, that actually we've got transferable skills and knowledge that we're providing that are just brilliant from learning about a business and transferable into the normal business world. Negotiation would be a really good example of how do you increase the levels of communication, so much in the way of soft skills besides hard skills. And that's that holistic approach to building the business owner. Because I think coming out of COVID, I've listened to some of the speakers this morning, and one of the things that I noticed was that we may have an increase in unemployment, and we may have an increase in the number of businesses that don't succeed. But actually, there's going to be a raft of other opportunities, if you like, the silver lining that's going to come up out of all of that. From our perspective, the more resilient and the more able you are, competent you can make people to be to spot the opportunity, then the easier it will be to take a level of confidence into that conversation. There's this lovely saying by Seneca from 2,000 years ago, and he said, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And I think in this economic development world that we function in, a lot of what we do is how do we get prepared, people prepared for the opportunity when it arrives. And quite often we get approached because they have an opportunity, but they're not prepared for it. And so what we want to do is to reverse that little matrix in some way, shape or form, so that as they bring something to life, they're plugging in continual micro-credentials that might support the development and sustainability of that business. We also asked a question about what are some of the biggest challenges that they've faced. And you can see from this graph, there's a very even spread in here, from financial management to finding customers, sales, technology, grow the business. You all know that matrix out of entrepreneurship, keep, grow. But this one here, that I love this one, this next one is feeling alone and isolated. And I'll come back to that. Uncertainty about the future, COVID-19. So this is a scale out of 5. So on each of these, nothing hits 5, which is kind of interesting, but 3.71 is sales. And in a COVID world, which is 3.4, the ability to make sales in a COVID world, that's a different kind of challenge. There is uncertainty about the future. There is a question about how do I price my product. But this other one about connecting to the local business ecosystem, I'd like to connect that one to feeling alone and isolated. I think we have this opportunity to create little cohorts or business ecosystems. I talked about it earlier in this presentation, to create a connectedness between the business owner and the business ecosystem that actually takes away that feeling of aloneness or isolation. So we work really hard in our own way to develop that business ecosystem through the Pop-Up Business School. But we know that our economic development agencies are running big ships and often on really tight budgets. And the consequence of all of that means that Sometimes it's a matter of where do you prioritize the position, where do you position so that you can help the most amount of people for the least amount of money, or is it that you have to help a few because the bang for buck in that few is much bigger than the scattergun? I would be fair to say that the Pop-Up Business School is definitely a scattergun. We don't target any particular sectors. We just target people who want to start a business, and how do we help them to get off the ground, and what is it that we can do to make them feel included in a cohort, not alone and isolated, and how do we connect them, importantly, to your local business ecosystems. And listen, we're not saying we get it right all the time. We don't. But what we do have an ethos around is striving for that success factor. And again, we don't have all the answers, but I would like to think that in this presentation this afternoon, we've been able to generate some interest and some information. You know, from a purely selfish point of view, I would love to bring the Pop-Up Business School to every region in New Zealand, because we believe so much that, that within each region, there's more that we can do to support the economic development and the economic impact and the economic, the individual capability growth within each region. But I don't have all the answers. If we can be part of the journey and we can represent those entrepreneurs as part of this journey, then hopefully we've done a job. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Tony. Clearly, obviously, one of the things which has been discussed today is when you do see unfortunate increases in unemployment, etc., that there's often an entrepreneurial route out of that. There's opportunities for people to kind of set up and start new businesses. And I'm sure that's something that in most of our regions, people will be considering how to provide some of that support and kind of guidance. I guess one of the questions I'd have for you would be, obviously, relatively new in New Zealand, but Pop-Up Business School been going overseas for a bit longer than that. And obviously this need to kind of change and pivot in response to the current kind of climate. How do you see the products and services that are offered in the business support and startup space, not just for Pop-Up Business School, but more generally, how might they need to change in a kind of post-COVID environment?
As a personal reflection and perspective, I think it's all about the business ecosystem in each region. From our experience, even though we work really hard to connect them into that system, an example, I'll give you one example, which is Nationwide Business Mentors New Zealand, is part of every ecosystem across the country. And another one is the New Zealand Business Number and business.gov.nz. But to be honest, that's only the tip of the iceberg. It's not what Business Hawke's Bay will do, or Northland Inc. will do, or Christchurch NZ will do. Each of them will have their own flavours. And so my reflection on how that can change is how you bring that ecosystem to life and make it incredibly accessible as, if you like, a bundle of, I was part of MBIE's Boost program in Business Hawke's Bay, goodness me, November last year. And in a room was a business ecosystem across government. And I think it's that kind of strategy where a small business owner has suddenly got access. They can go through a door and there are a number of other doors they can open, but it's actually really accessible and easy, and they feel our experience again. I think that's one thing that all of the economic development agents, I'm not saying that they're not doing it now, but I think it's one thing that can make a real difference to the small business owner.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's great. So thank you very much. Now the questions have come through and we're coming towards the end of the time for today. It's been a really good first day to the Congress. We're looking forward to all of you joining us again tomorrow. Tomorrow's program starts at 10 a.m. again, and it will be the same link. Susan's just posted it up there. The same link as you used today will get you in tomorrow. Tomorrow's theme is all about how ready were we? And there's some really good speakers again tomorrow. So you'll hear not only for some practitioners that have been involved at the coalface in kind of, you know, the response, as well as some of our key sort of thinkers and influencers around this, and an opportunity to also hear both from government and from the national spokesperson for economic development, Todd McClay. So some of you will remember a few years ago, the last election, when we held a face-to-face conference in Wellington. We did it was a great job at being able to hear from each of the parties. So we'll be able to do that again. So the presentation, a couple of things coming through. Presentations all been recorded, so they will be made available. And so you'll be able to access them once Susan's had a chance. She's going to put them up this evening, she said. So you'll be able to dive back into them and share them with colleagues as you wish. And that'll be true through the rest of this week as well. So from me, thank you all for tuning in. And I look forward to hearing you all tomorrow. And thanks to all the speakers today, and to you, Tony.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Great. See you all again in the morning.